efforts. So we're going to continue with our talks. We've got 4 more talks, and then we will have the panel and an opportunity to follow up on some of the issues. But we want to make sure we have time for that. So I'm going to ask the speakers to try and really stick to their times, and we'll see how we do with questions. The next speaker is Liz Bennett. She is the Director of Hunting and Wildlife Trade Program of the Wildlife Conservation Society. And as you've read in her bio, she's done a lot of work all over, but primarily in Sarawak in Malaysia. And she will be talking about draining the tropical forests, loss of wildlife to hunting and trade.
Thanks very much indeed, Christian. Thanks particularly also to Bill and Joe for bringing us all together and making this all happen. I'm going to get away from some of these little itsy-bitsy things that you can hardly see to some big, fuzzy, feathered, furry things. Much of the humid tropical world, as we've been hearing for the first half of the afternoon, is a mosaic of various types of intact and disturbed and regenerating forests. But even with the levels of loss that we've been hearing about and disturbance permeating a lot of those remaining forests, there's enough areas of forest left for healthy populations of most species of wildlife to actually do rather well. And again, I'm talking about, all through this talk, I'm talking terrestrial vertebrates. So I'm talking a small proportion of Nigel's 2.7% of species on the planet. But they're the ones that tend to be very conspicuous and tend to be very prominent in our minds when we go into these areas. Well, at least in my mind. But that takes no account of the threats invisible, but looking at forest cover and forest structure alone, which is hunting, which is primarily what I'm going to talk about, and I'll mention a little bit about disease as well, which are the sort of almost unseen killers going on inside the forests. Hunting is actually a greater problem for conservation in tropical forests than in many other habitats. So what I'm going to do briefly this afternoon is look at why hunting in tropical forests is such a problem, the current rates of hunting and wildlife trade, very briefly a little mention of the impact of disease, the effects of hunting on wildlife populations, on forest biodiversity, and on forest peoples, and so we don't end up on a totally depressing note, what we can do about it. Now, people have been hunting in wildlife in tropical forests as long as we've been in tropical forests. At least 10,000 years in Latin America, and probably at least 100,000 years in Africa. And that's, the recent estimates is that that's actually a gross underestimate. So people have been out there hunting for a long time. And by definition, if a species is there today, hunting must have been sustainable in the past. But we've had a lot of rapid changes occurring, and now hunting is a real threat to many of these species. So let's run through quickly what's changed. Well, first of all, there's a lot more of us than there used to be. And this is where this does tie in with the Wright and Muller-Landau model. We've shown very clearly the more people there are in an area of forest, the more hunting pressure there is, irrespective of the details of the type of forest. And if you look just in Central Africa alone, in the last 50 years, in countries across Central Africa, human populations have increased by something between 250 and 350%, depending on the country. So that's just a lot more people out there potentially hunting and eating wildlife. Forest areas, as we've heard earlier this afternoon, have decreased. Remaining forests are much more accessible, and once you get a road going into a forest through logging, through mining, through other forms of development, then hunters and weapons immediately go in, and wildlife can very rapidly and economically flow out down to towns, so that when it would have taken someone a week or more to walk into an area of forest and it wouldn't have been worth carrying the wildlife out, now they can be in and out in a few hours. And finally, hunters now use modern weapons, and most animals are now hunted using either shotguns or wire snares, and even when you get into places like Cambodia and DRC, weapons of war, such as even landmines. If you want to catch a tiger in Cambodia, lay a landmine, trap a monkey next to it, and you've got your tiger bones. So these are all much more discriminating and much more efficient than traditional weapons. But the final big thing that I'll talk quite a bit is that hunting has become commercialized. People used to hunt mainly to feed their own families, and actually a lot of people still do. But now, in addition to that, wildlife is sold to supply these major commercial markets across the world for anything from food, trophies, pets, to traditional medicines on a pretty large scale. Commercial logging causes many of these changes, irrespective of the logging intensity. What logging does is it gives us the increased access through the roads, and it gives greatly increased human populations, both because of the logging company workers and their families themselves, and also the colonists that come in along the roads as the logging progresses. And as we know, logging has spread very rapidly over the last 50, 60 years. This is the spread of logging throughout, concessions throughout the tropical forest part of Cameroon, and a similar picture for Gabon, and we could do this for almost any tropical country that we know of, particularly in Africa and Asia. So this is now a global business, and every single one of these arrows is actually, I mean, slightly hypothetically, obviously, but basically a real trade route for wildlife trade around the world nowadays, broadly going from tropical forest countries in the center and south to the more wealthy countries in the north, with some exceptions, but that's the broad pattern. Now, I said that the productivity of tropical forests that hunting is a real problem in tropical forests. Well, why? It's because the productivity of tropical forests for edible animals, for tradable animals, is pretty low. Each of these bars is a different site across the tropical world. Each of them is pretty intact and pretty unhunted. So these are densities pretty near carrying capacity, as much as can be told. The dark green sites are the tropical forests, the closed forest sites. And as you can see from that, just the biomass of animals there, this is all rodents, ungulates, and primates, is very low. In addition, if you picture a tropical forest, all the food is kind of up there if you're a mammal, and so you need to be small and agile to get it. So you basically need to be a primate. And relative to body weight, primates breed more slowly than many other mammal groups. So again, this all means that you can't take many animals there without starting to knock your populations down. Tropical grasslands, on the other hand, all the food for mammals is on the ground. You can be big, you can browse around, you can be an ungulate. In Latin America, you can be a rodent, and you can get very large numbers. And that means that overall, there's just a lot more animals out there. These groups of animals tend to breed much more rapidly, so your sustainable output is much higher. Your sustainable hunting rates can be very much higher compared to closed forests. So this is why these forests are very vulnerable to overhunting. And my colleague John Robinson and I worked out that tropical forests can only sustainably support about 1 person per square kilometre if they depend totally on wildlife for their protein. And there's very few tropical forests in the world, apart from some very remote parts of Amazonia, whose population densities are anywhere near that low these days. Now, on top of that, the rapid access between forests and cities means that forest isn't just feeding those local populations, it's potentially feeding large urban populations. Often those have increasing wealth, and we know that that's an increasing driver of wildlife trade. So in a sense, the effective population drawing from that forest is vast. On top of that, you've got globalization, which makes it even worse. So an animal that's in a Malaysian forest today could be in Guangzhou or Milan tomorrow. And so that makes almost infinite the potential demand on those animals, and no forest can sustain that level of potential demand. So in terms of the current scale of the trade, in Equatorial Guinea, in one market in Malabo, about 13,000 wild mammals are sold per year. Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, and when you hit Asia, this is where your numbers get really big, has more than 1,500 restaurants alone selling wildlife meat. On the pet trade side, in Pramuka Bird Market in Java, about 1.5 million wild birds are sold every year for the songbird trade. These are data from Traffic, the Wildlife Trade Monitoring Organization, who showed that in the year 2000, Sumatra was exporting 25 tons of turtles per week to China. And just one of many big pangolin seizures this year. Pangolins are the big scaly anteaters. That about 23 tons were seized in Vietnam en route between Indonesia and China. And as you can see here in the fridge, this is just straight commercial scale trade. This isn't a few hunters selling their stuff beside the road. The world's largest importers of wildlife driving a lot of this trade are China and the USA. As far as we know, bearing in mind a lot of this is illegal. In terms of the USA, over a 10-year period, trade in wildlife and wildlife products increased by about 75%. In 2000, legal shipments of, these are legal shipments of wild live animals, mainly for the pet trade, were pretty large in coming into this country. And this is illegal, unofficial estimates are that many tons of bushmeat from Africa are coming into the US every month. And I'm told that if you know where to go, you can buy it in DC. China, around the other side of the world, is thought to be the world's largest importer of turtles, of ivory, of tiger skins and bones, and of pangolins, and it's thought to be the most important market for many other species as well. These 25 tons of turtles a week I talked about in Sumatra, that's now down to about 7 tons, basically because Sumatra is starting to run out of wild turtles, and turtles are now being sourced from elsewhere to China, including from Florida, which is starting to have to increase its own regulations to put quotas on turtle exports. Quantifying the trade is difficult since a lot of it, particularly in the more endangered species, is illegal, with many methods of concealment used. These are pangolins in these boxes at the bottom again, taken by our Indonesia staff. Some less successfully than others in terms of concealing the thing. As hunting is more for sale, you get a typical boom and bust wildlife trade. So when it's just for subsistence, on the left of the graph here, then your hunting levels tend to be below a sort of theoretical sustainable level. But once a logging road goes in or some other change, then suddenly people hunt more, they sell more, so your output is more, but then it crashes down again as the species within that area becomes extinct. Or just down to levels where it's just not hunted so much. And then what happens is that either the trade switches to other species or else it switches to other parts of the landscape. So overall, your impact of the losses increase out across the landscape. Some species are definitely more vulnerable to hunting than others. They tend to be the same types of species that Nigel was talking about. Especially vulnerable are ones that breed very slowly, large-bodied, slow breeding, such as great apes and other primates, elephants, tapirs, that live or breed in large groups so that when you're a hunter you know where to go and you can get quite a lot of animals all at one go, such as commonly nesting birds like these Paleo in Sulawesi, and again primates. Have loud or conspicuous displays so that they're calling and the hunters can tune in on those, particularly territorial species. So species like gibbons, hornbills, crassids, again, are particularly vulnerable. And ones that are slow and easy to catch. So that's our turtles and our pangolins, because their natural defenses are against things like cats. They're not against humans. And in fact, in Sarawak, the hunters used to say that the tortoises there, they even come in their own cooking pots. Another part of the problem is weak governance and low political will to address the problem in a lot of tropical forest countries. Tropical forest countries have a lot of problems and issues, and wildlife trade isn't normally pretty high on the list. Much of the trade involves criminal networks. There's often very low capacity among wildlife staff, however well-intentioned they might be. There are not very many of them. They're often not very well trained or inappropriately trained, and they're certainly not well supported by the entire system that they're working in to address the type of wildlife trade that we're talking about here. So wildlife is definitely vanishing. Vietnam is the most extreme example of this that I know of, where about 12 species of large animals have become extinct or almost extinct since about 1950, with hunting being a very major contributor to it. Even protected areas, however good they are from some ways, are not giving much protection here. This Kuba National Park is a lovely national park close to the capital of Sarawak, Kuching, where I lived for many years. The park looks gorgeous. It's fantastic forest, but all the primates and hornbills have been hunted out. Similar thing in northeast Sulawesi, in a nice little nature reserve there. Over a 15-year period, the large mammals there, their populations basically have crashed, and the dwarf buffaloes here, the Anoa, are now extinct there. Northern Thailand, similar thing. In these two national parks in northern Thailand, all the elephants, tigers, and wild cattle have gone. Now, we tend to think, or at least I tend to think, of this problem being most acute in Asia because of the smaller areas of forest remaining and because of the very high pressures of demand. But it's not unique to Asia. In Kilimijim National Forest area up in western Cameroon, in the past 50 years, many species of large mammals have gone, and our Cameroon staff tell us that hunters are now out there using rodent traps to get their bushmeats because the big stuff basically isn't worth going after anymore. In Banyang and Bo in Cameroon again, in the past 10 years, ungulates are now so rare, again, people are mainly hunting rodents. John Farr and his colleagues from Durrell have shown that hunting in Bioko in Equatorial Guinea has reduced primate populations by about 90% in some areas to local extinction in others. And we think of Amazonia as, you know, there's some pretty good forest left out there. But Carlos Perez has shown that at more than 100 sites across the Amazon, the density and biomass of the main game species are 83% and 91% lower, respectively, in heavily hunted areas compared with lightly hunted areas, even here. So across the humid tropics, overhunting is leading to what's known as the empty forest syndrome. Forests that, if you're doing your satellite imagery, look absolutely fabulous, but are getting quiet and without the large animals in them. Another contributor to empty forest is disease. This is not my area of expertise, but I'm going to mention it because it's important. And a couple of examples. In the past 10 years, the Ebola virus in northwest Congo has reduced some gorilla populations there by up to 95%. And we heard earlier a little bit about the fungal disease, I practiced this and I got it right before. Chytridiomycosis is devastating some amphibian populations. And in parts of Australia, and particularly the neotropics, this is now the single greatest cause of amphibian extinctions. And so, I'm not going to say more about it, but this should be on people's radars as well. Now, what happens if we wipe out lots of these large animals? Well, the animals are vital to tropical forests. They're not just living in it, they're an integral part of it. And the species which are hunted first tend to be the large mammals and birds, and they're really important in pollinating flowers, dispersing seeds, and keeping up a balance of the forest by browsing on the plants. And in some forests, such as in Gabon, 80% of tropical trees depend on large animals to disperse their seeds. You don't need to hunt a tiger to wipe tigers out. All you need to do is hunt their prey. And in India, human hunting can reduce tiger prey by up to about 90%. Now, the full ramifications of this are unknown. A lot of these things are happening pretty recently, and a lot of these processes are very complex and long-term. We do know that some keystone species play especially important roles, and if we lose them, it is going to have severe knock-on effects. One is elephants, which alter vegetation structure and composition. Another is top predators, who control the numbers of the herbivores and the smaller predators that they eat. So if they don't eat them anymore, their numbers get out of control and start having broader impacts on the plants and on the smaller animals. And major seed predators, for obvious reasons. If they go, then again, balances get out of joint lower down the food chain. Wild meat's also a really important source of livelihood support for remote forest people, and if wildlife disappears due to unsustainable trade, these very marginalized people face problems. So, for example, the Agta in the Philippines, over a 10-year period, the number of their hunts was successful, and the kills per hunt declined very greatly, and they became much more marginalized people, sort of on the edge of society. But there are solutions to this. I'm not going to send you away wildly depressed. And they tend to be much less complex to solve than some of the other issues that we hear about these complex land issues and what we will hear about in terms of global warming. Key to developing solutions is to recognize that not all hunting and wildlife trade is the same. One key distinction to make is between rural subsistence hunting and some of the long-distance commercial hunting. Rural subsistence hunting, it's often common species that people find around their farms. They tend to be faster breeding, not particularly endangered. Hunting can definitely be sustainable of some of these species, and also the hunting is really important to their livelihoods, either to their food or to their local income. By contrast, those arrows on the map that I showed, this long-distance wildlife trade is a whole different ballgame. Tends to contain a much higher proportion of endangered species because they're more valuable. Much of the wildlife is from protected areas and logging concessions. It's the first wave as these areas are opened up. It tends not to be sustainable because it's supplying these much larger markets and consumers, and it also tends to be a luxury trade, which means that from an ethical point of view as well as a practical one, it's easier to say we should be controlling this. So we need to look at the issue first to find out what we're talking about, and then we can come up with some solutions. And I'm going to very quickly, to finish off, go through 3 solutions that are working at different points along the trade chain. So if we think of our source of animals, they're the ones still living in the forest. Then they're transported out by various means to the urban consumers. So one example of a project which is working very successfully to protect animals at the source is in logging concessions. I've said they're part of the problem. That also means they must be part of the solution. Here in northern Congo, we have big logging concessions surrounding the 4,000 square kilometer Nubali and Ndoki National Park. Here, the Wildlife Conservation Society is working with the logging company and the government. We're currently managing about 2 million hectares of concession. When the concession opened, there was massive immigration of whole extended families into the area, which caused a great escalation in hunting. Lots of things going on with the program. First, really critical research, what's going on, what's the impacts, who's doing what. And then education programs for local communities and company employees. Developing alternative protein sources. You can't tell people not to hunt if they haven't got anything else to eat. And most important, enforcement to stop any wildlife leaving the area for outside trade, employing local people as well-trained guards in the area, and the wildlife there is absolutely flourishing, and it's a fabulous place to go to see some of Central Africa's best wildlife, even though it's a logging concession. An example of cutting the trade chain here in the middle to stop it being transported out. If it's not transported out, then people won't hunt it. Again, we're in Central Africa, we're back in Cameroon. Here in Cameroon, the roads are kind of a mess, particularly during the rainy season, and the most reliable way of getting anything down to the big cities of Yaoundé and Douala in the south is the railway. So we're working there with the railways and the government to stop wild meat being transported by the train from wild areas in the north and center of the country down to the big cities in the south. And this just shows the confiscations of wild meat on the train as the program progressed. Initially, as you'd expect, a considerable peak. Then as people are learning that this isn't the world's best idea, then it's tailing off. And we hear that the markets in Yaoundé now, at least you can't buy primate meat there very readily, so it's clearly having significant success. Then finally, one example at the urban consumer end. This is my old stomping ground in Sarawak in Malaysia, where WCS worked with the Sarawak Forest Department for many years, resulting in preparing and implementing a master plan for wildlife. And one of the main themes was controlling hunting and wildlife trade. Again, based on many years of research, studying hunting by the local communities, surveying the wildlife populations to see what impact the different levels of hunting were having, and then holding dialogues at many levels, from rural hunting communities through to topmost government officials. A core step was a law which totally banned all commercial sale of wildlife and wildlife products taken from the wild, while still allowing hunting by rural people of non-protected species for their own subsistence. So again, making this rural-urban split. Again, the dual coins of both sides of the coins of education and enforcement to put it into effect, and the major urban wildlife trade has almost totally been stopped. Finally, what are the elements of success in programs that we know that work across the world? One is long-term programs to build the knowledge and also to build the relationships and trust. You can't just go in out and quickly. This takes many years. Multiple partners bringing complementary skills. Sufficient capacity, resources and motivation at all levels, which is critical, from the forests through to the markets, including people like the judiciary and the senior levels of government to make the whole system work. And scientific monitoring and adaptive management to make sure that what we're actually doing is having the desired effect. So, there is a tropical extinction crisis for these large creatures. If it's unchecked, many species are going to disappear due in part to uncontrolled hunting and wildlife trade. But, unlike many of the other factors that we're hearing about this afternoon, we actually know how to manage this one. So what we need to do is apply that much more widely and rapidly across the tropical forest world. Thank you.
See if there's one or two quick questions. Otherwise, we'll come back to the broader issue in the debate. Okay, so we'll come back. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Appreciate it. Okay, next up is Joe Wright, who is a staff scientist at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. And he's the guy that was being wrestled down to the ground. You remember? You saw him there, but here's the real guy. And he's going to talk about the future of tropical forests on a warmer planet. Very relevant topic, very important.
Thank you, Christian. For the record, I don't think Nigel could do that, but we'll have to try it someday. Without my glasses, I can't see the escape button. There it is. Where are all these? We missed letting you know what our plan was with this symposium. The first talks before the coffee break were to set up the stage for habitat loss as a threat, as an extinction threat in the tropics, and how one might go about evaluating that threat. The first two talks after the break are about the other major threats: direct persecution, hunting that Liz just told us about, and climate change that I'm going to talk about. The two talks that are going to follow me are going to be about actions that are being taken in the tropics today to conserve biodiversity, so as Liz says, you don't go home hopelessly depressed. And the last talk, I'm going to give a very brief synopsis. If we've created any fog, hopefully I'll be able to get rid of the fog. I'm going to talk about climate change right now, which I believe is a much greater threat to tropical biodiversity than habitat loss over this century. My talk's going to break down into two parts. First, I'm going to outline the problem. That's going to involve a crash course in the tropical climate, a crash course in climate change and its implications for biodiversity, and then an overview of how forests are distributed with respect to temperature and what it might look like in a warmer planet. And the second part of the talk, very quickly, will be a couple of case studies of things that are already happening. This is my first data slide. It shows the latitudinal gradient in temperature across the planet. The black line is mean annual temperature. The red and blue are the hottest and coldest months of the year. This is going to tell you a lot about the global real estate market right now as the American baby boomers retire. You might be thinking about retiring in southern Florida, somewhere around here, and you're going to have this much seasonal variation in temperature. But here in the core tropics, it's an amazing part of the world, from 10 degrees south latitude to about 10 degrees north latitude, a 20-degree latitudinal band, that's about the same as the continental lower 48 in the US, there's virtually no seasonal temperature variation. Come and join me in Panama to retire, and you won't have to maintain a house back in Maryland for the summers in Florida, or back in Michigan, you can have one year-round home. And if you don't believe me, that's the seasonal temperature range at the different sites. There's Florida with about a 25-degree Fahrenheit seasonal temperature range. There's Panama with about a 2-degree Fahrenheit seasonal temperature range. So if you want to retire, come and join me. But this has huge impacts for biodiversity also. Before I get to that, global climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in its 2007 report evaluated 21 different global climate models and their predictions. And as far as temperature went, their predictions were all pretty similar. They all predicted increases in temperature. They all predicted increases of about the same amount and with the same latitudinal distribution. You can put in as inputs to the models different emissions scenarios, and this is one realization of a model for an intermediate scenario of, these are carbon emissions, mostly greenhouse gas emissions. This is what the maps look like that the IPCC puts out. But if you convert that into data, which I presented here, which is the increase in temperature over land by latitudinal bands, you can see that there is a latitudinal gradient with the greatest increases expected in the northern hemisphere. This is why the polar bears are in trouble right now. But across the tropics, across 40 degrees of latitude here, from the Tropic of Capricorn to the Tropic of Cancer, we're expecting a very similar increase, and it's not negligible. It's over 3 degrees centigrade. It's over 6 degrees Fahrenheit increase by the end of this century. Now, that is an intermediate emissions scenario. Emissions are actually rising much faster than has been anticipated. So this can be thought of probably as a conservative estimate of what's really going to happen. The temperatures are going to go up more than that, most likely. And think about the tropics. It's already, from those first 2 slides I showed you, the hottest place on the planet. And it's about to get hotter. This slide summarizes a remarkable study that just came out from some folks at the University of Washington in Seattle. And they took about 40 species of insects from different places in the world and raised entire populations in incubators at different temperatures, held everything else constant except the temperature, raised each species at a wide range of temperatures. And they plotted what they call relative fitness. It's actually the population growth rate in the incubator against the temperature. And these curves for, this is, in the left panel is a species from England. These are true bugs, hemipterans, species name there. The curves are rather similar for this temperate species and this tropic species from 6 degrees north latitude, low latitude tropics in equatorial Africa in Benin. The curves fall to 0 at lower temperatures. The species would go extinct if that was the temperature. It can't maintain a population growth rate. The curve has an optimum temperature where the population growth rate is lowest. And then after that optimum, it falls very quickly back to 0. This is an incredibly rapid descent back to 0. Again, the species is going to go extinct. It can't maintain a positive population growth rate at that temperature. The curve for the temperate zone and tropical species are rather similar. This one's a little bit wider, as you might expect, because the seasonal range in temperature, as we just saw, is so much greater in England than it is in equatorial Africa. But the important point here isn't the width of the curves or their shape. More, it's this, which is the actual temperatures observed, a histogram of temperatures observed where this species exists over the course of a year, and this line being the mean temperature at the site, and this, which is the temperatures at the African site this species comes from, and the mean. The temperate species is living very far from its optimum temperature. At this latitude, we expect about a 5 degrees C increase in temperature. It's just going to push the species toward its optimum. Things are going to get better. The tropical species, on the other hand, is already very close to its optimum. The more modest 3-degree increase is going to push it past its optimum, push it into this very dangerous zone where extinction becomes a real possibility. So these tropical species are much more sensitive to small increases in temperature than our temperate zone species because of the very different temperature regimes that we have in the tropics and the temperate zone for the last 100 million years. It's kind of a double whammy. The bottom panel here is a plot I've put together which just plots the distances. The shading represents distances between a point on the Earth's surface where the temperature in the 1960s equals the closest point, the distance to the closest point where you'll find an equal temperature in the year 2100. The top figure here shows the mean distance, area-weighted mean distance by latitude. In the temperate zones, these distances are rather short. In the tropics, these distances are getting up to 400 kilometers. The great blocks of tropical forest to the left we've already seen are here in the Amazon, here in the Congo River, Central Africa. There, the distances are much larger. Look at my scale. They're greater than 1,000 and even greater than 2,000 kilometers that these species are going to have to disperse to find a cool refuge later this century that matches the temperature that they've evolved with. And the reason for that is this absence of a latitudinal temperature gradient in the tropics. You go over 47 degrees of latitude from the Tropic of Cancer to the Tropic of Capricorn, and there's virtually no change in mean temperature. Leave the tropics and you have this abrupt gradient. You only have to go 140 kilometers to have a 1 degree centigrade change in temperature if you're moving north-south in the temperate zones. And that underlies this very strong difference. So these tropical species face a double whammy. They're most sensitive to temperature changes, and they're going to have to move the furthest to find a cool refuge in the future. But that doesn't do the whole picture justice. We have to consider the distribution of forests relative to temperature to really understand the dimensions of the problem. It's a very simple exercise. I just took a publicly available data set provided by the European Space Program. It's a land cover in the year 2000 from Spot 4 vegetation instrument, and I superimposed that with a global climate data set from the IPCC for the 1980s. And here I have the distribution for tropical forest of the temperature distribution of tropical forest in the 1980s. This next slide summarizes that global distribution for tropical forest and forest in the North Temperate Zone. And the distributions are remarkably different. North Temperate forests are over an incredibly wide, a 25 degrees centigrade range of temperatures. A small increase in temperature, there's going to be plenty of species elsewhere in the biome that are already adapted to that warmer temperature. The situation in the tropics is very different. The distribution is much narrower. And pay particular attention to what happens at 25, 26, 27 degrees C. We go from 5 million to 4 million to less than 1 million to virtually no forest at 28 degrees C. Remember, our increase in temperature is 3 degrees C. 25 is going to become 28. So what's going to happen? Is all of our forest going to disappear by the end of this century? This shows the distribution of all tropical land with respect to temperature and the 5 basic broad land cover types. And we can see there is land out here at 28 and 29. The hottest places in the world. These are mostly in the southern Sahara and the Sahel region in Africa, also the Atacama Desert in South America. And what we find is mostly desert, herbaceous is grasslands and savannas, a little bit of shrub cover, and no forest, and some agriculture. Now, it looks like maybe all our forest is going to disappear, but I don't think it's that simple. This next slide adds precipitation. At tropical temperatures, you need about 1 meter of rainfall to sustain forest. So if we were to go across here, sort of all this is too dry for forest. And notice at 28, I've got my axis reversed here so we can see the interesting part of the figure. At 28 and 29C, there's very little, virtually no land with more than 1 meter of tropical rainfall. So what's going to happen when we get our 3 degrees C temperature increase? We're going to take this vast area that's much wetter and move it over here. into much hotter temperatures. We're going to have a novel climate that's not found anywhere on the planet today, where it's very hot and wet. And how these species are going to respond to this novel climate, we don't know. So that outlines the scope of the problem that we have. Tropical species are particularly sensitive to temperature change. Dispersal distances to cool refuges are large. Forests in the 1960s only existed where temperatures averaged less than this, 28. By the end of this century, 75% of all tropical forests are going to be warmer. What's going to happen? We don't know. My case studies concern what's already happening. We've already observed temperature increases. Of course, you know about this for the Alaska and the polar bear situation, but we also are seeing temperature increases in the tropics. In fact, in the last 25 years, we've averaged about a 0.6 centigrade, about a 1 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature in the last 25 years across basically the entire tropics. That's a very modest increase. Has it had any effect? This morning, a couple of our speakers already spoke about the Center for Tropical Forest Science that the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute has organized. A couple of my colleagues and I took a look at this data to look at what was happening to the growth rates of trees. Basically, we put a tape around the tree and we measure its diameter. And we return 5 years later and measure the tree again. And we've been doing this for something on the order of 3 million trees. The two sites with the longest temporal records are in Panama and Malaysia. So we took those two sites and we looked at how the growth rates, this is the increase between two consecutive censuses, how that growth rate has changed through time. And we got this very surprising result. The wood growth rates are declining for shrubs, for understory small treelets, also for the big canopy trees. It's more modest, but it's still a decline. In Malaysia, the other side of the planet, almost exactly the other side of the planet, the same pattern turned up. These are both old-growth forests. There's never been any logging at either of these sites. That's why they were chosen to become scientific research sites. There's been a paleobotanical study done at the site in Panama. There's no history of agriculture at the site, digging pits. There's absolutely no human agriculture anywhere in the record. These are primary forests. Why is the tree growth slowing down like this? At the Panama site only, we also have a very long record of the production of flowers, fruits, and seeds. This is my colleague, Osvaldo Calderon, and every week for the last 22 years, he has gone and identified every flower, fruit, and seed in 200 of these traps arrayed randomly out in the forest. He's counted more and identified the species more than 3 million items. And we got this extremely surprising result. This is flower production, that we're seeing these dramatic increase. This is for about 30 species of lianas. It's about a 4 to 5% per year increase. So in 20 years, the production of flowers by lianas has doubled in this old growth primary forest. For about 50 tree species, it's about a 2% a year increase. So after 20 years, it's almost a 50% increase in flower production. We believe this increase is related to temperature. I have a lot of analyses I can't show here because of time, but these peak years are our warmest years. There are two big El Nino events that had a huge impact on the climate in Panama, and it was much warmer than normal. Reproduction was much higher. And I've got a lot more sophisticated analyses than that that make the connection with temperature. And we think what we're seeing is a shift in allocation by these plants. Small increases in temperature are leading to a shift in allocation. The plants are allocating their resources, their carbon, their nitrogen, their nutrients to flowering and fruiting, putting less into wood growth. And this is the kind of shift that could lead to a positive feedback. The flowers, the fruits, the seeds, the vast majority of seeds fall to the forest floor and they decompose that same year. Wood, on the other hand, is going to be there for centuries because these trees live for centuries, up to a millennium and more. An individual tree will live. So as the plants, if they are really shifting this allocation and putting more of their resources into reproduction and less into wood, they'll be sequestering less carbon. They'll be taking less carbon out of the atmosphere. And this huge biome, despite the deforestation rates, it still covers something like 10 or 11 million square kilometers of tropical forest on the planet. About the area of the United States, including Alaska, is in tropical forest today. This huge biome will absorb less carbon from the atmosphere. More carbon gives more in the atmosphere, gives higher temperatures, gives more reproduction, and you have a positive feedback. I'm going to mention the frogs and the, I'll try the pronunciation, Chytridiomycosis. I think I did it. This is work by Karen Lips and her colleagues who've been working in Costa Rica and Panama, and they've followed over the last 20 years the frog declines advancing on this front and the arrival of this species of fungus. It's kind of the smoking gun that proves cause and effect. The fungus is causing the extinction. Up to 165 species have been driven extinct, at least in the wild, since 1980. There's a zoologist at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Ecuador in Quito, Luis Coloma, who has 27 species of frogs in tanks in the basement of the zoology building that are found nowhere else. They're gone from the wild. Most of these extinctions have been in the tropical Andes, and there's a very direct tie-in to climate change in the tropical Andes. This small change in temperature has almost no direct effect on the frogs, but it greatly favors the fungus and really changes the interaction. So climate change is definitely implicated here. The fungus continues to spread to new species in new regions, and we are living through a mass extinction of tropical montane frogs. It's not happening in the lowlands. The fungus's temperature dependence is such that right now it's happening only in the highlands. My last slide is an example from Steve Williams and his group at James Cook University, my last couple of slides. This is that little bit of tropical rainforest in Australia that Nigel mentioned. And Steve and his group have been looking at vertebrates in that rainforest. This is the Herbert River ring-tailed opossum, I believe. Yep, I remembered that correctly. This is a Google Earth view of the area. It's very mountainous. These mountains catch the rain coming off the Coral Sea. And Steve's done about 5,000 surveys for vertebrates. The little red dots represent where he found this possum. The climate is known to extraordinary detail in this region. It's work that Steve Turton has done also at James Cook. And with putting the climate data together with the vertebrate census data, they can develop a climatic model of where each species can be found. And this is the model for the ring-tailed possum. The red is where the species is definitely found, its core habitat. The yellow is marginal habitat where it might or might not be found. And now we can apply global warming. We can change the climate. Let's change it by 1.5 degrees. Our species range retracts quite a bit. That's what's already happened. I guess it's just 1 degree. It's what's already happened in this part of the world. Let's go to 3 degrees, which is what we're predicting for the tropics as a whole by the end of this century under a conservative scenario. And our species is left on the top of a couple of little mountains. Notice no more red, just yellow. And Northeast Australia is having much more warming than the rest of the tropics. The expected increase there under intermediate emissions scenarios, conservative increase is 5C, and this species is gone, as are many others in Steve's analyses. My take-home messages, I've already gone over the first 4. I won't repeat them. I'll just add number 5, which is that climate change is already implicated in an ongoing extinction. Habitat loss, we're always talking about extinction, species committed to extinctions, extinctions that are going to happen sometime down the road. These are extinctions that already happened in the last 25 years and are going on right now. My conclusion is that global warming is going to have its greatest impact on biodiversity in the tropics, even though the warming is predicted to be greater at higher latitudes. The polar bear is getting all the attention today. For reasons that I don't understand, the polar bear is still with us. 165 frog species are no longer with us. Thank you.
All right, that was very, very interesting, Joe. Thank you. Let's see if there are any quick questions. I'm sure this issue of global change is going to be a big one for our panel. Then we're going to hold until the panel, Joe. Thank you for a very interesting, provocative talk. Next up, we're back to you, Bill. Bill Laurance, who you already met before, and he's going to talk now about islands of survival. Will tropical nature reserves be arks for imperiled species? Bill.
Okay, hello again. My talk is actually going to focus on protected areas and the prospects for which protected areas, which are really our flagships in many ways for biodiversity conservation, are going to be able to sustain biodiversity, tropical biodiversity in the future. I should emphasize that my original title here was Islands of Survival, Will Tropical Nature Reserves Be Arks for Imperiled Species? And I changed that to biodiversity for a specific reason, and that is that a lot of the discussions that we've been hearing, particularly making reference to the fact that there have been relatively low numbers of documented species extinctions, have focused particularly on the notion of species. And really when biologists talk about biodiversity, we mean more than just species. We mean whole levels and layers of biological complexity. So below the level of species, for example, we have all the geographic variation and other things that are implicit within that. For species, we have subspecies, we have individual populations, and within those there is large amounts of genetic variation and demographic variation, behavioral variation. So there's much of this type of variation is being lost as species geographic ranges and population sizes are collapsing. For example, tigers today are clinging to survival in something like 1% of their original geographic range. Above the level of species, of course, we have things like communities and ecosystems and biomes, and these also have inherent properties, a natural dynamic that occurs when you have an intact ecosystem. And again, in many cases, what we're doing is altering ecosystems through fragmentation, hunting, climate change, whatever it might be, and we're changing the properties of the ecosystem. So I think we really need, when we talk about the biodiversity crisis, we're not just talking about losing species. We're talking about losing genetic diversity, biological diversity, ecological functioning, a whole set of characteristics that characterize natural ecosystems and that really define nature. So focusing particularly on tropical reserves, well, first of all, there's some good news. And one of the real bits of good news is that the number of reserves has definitely increased in the tropics. And in fact, I think that some of the people who have been accused of hand-waving in the past are, to a substantial degree, should be credited with the fact that there's been so much attention, so much concern about tropical nature vanishing, and so we've seen an expansion of protected areas. And particularly if you consider things like semi-protected areas, which could include production forests, and indigenous lands. The Brazilian Amazon alone really pushes up the percentage of protected areas globally because it's got so many large indigenous lands. But there's bad news as well. In a few decades, as we've seen because of the rampant loss of old-growth forest, in a few decades, relatively little old-growth primary forest is going to survive outside nature reserves. These are really going to be our islands of primary forest. Many ecosystems, if you break it down and you look at, in fact, tropical forests are not homogeneous. There's enormous variation and subtle variation that's not necessarily apparent to the naked eye caused by climate and edaphic factors and a very complex interplay of historical factors. And if you break down the tropical forests and really look at them in more detail, you see that many ecosystems and regions are poorly represented in reserves, in some cases not represented at all in reserves. And also, many of the reserves may be vulnerable to external threats for a variety of reasons. And so this is what I'm going to be focusing on now, is the viability of reserves. And there's a whole different suite, as we heard, of different kinds of threats, things that can affect these protected areas, habitat loss both within and around the reserve, changing fire regimes, roads and highways, climate change, of course, hunting pressure, exotic pathogens, and other things as well. There's a variety of threats that can penetrate into reserves or that can affect the reserves from the outside along their borders, can have important potential impacts on the nature reserve. Now, one of the real problems in trying to talk about this, what we're really trying to talk about is the composition and ecological functioning, the viability of the reserve, is that most of the data, a lot of the data that we see that we have readily available to us are from various kinds of remote sensing. And I've just listed 4 examples of some prominent studies that have been done here, such as, for example, Ruth DeFree's work, which is showing that many tropical reserves are becoming more isolated. Greg Asner's very well-known work on looking at the extent of logging in the Amazon. Nadine Laporte's work showing the explosion of logging in the Congo, and Joe Wright's work showing that fires are particularly increasing in countries that have a lot of corruption and a lot of poverty. One of the problems is that we're really lacking, particularly in a systematic way, data in terms of what's happening really in the forest, down on the ground. We have pieces of information from a few particular parts of the tropics. It's very scattered, it's very heterogeneous and limited. What we really lack is systematic data so that we can make broad-scale comparisons and examine broad-scale trends. And so I've been, for the last couple of years, have been organizing a study, which is really a giant meta-analysis, to try to get at this notion of what is happening to the tropical nature reserves. And so, particularly, we're asking 4 major questions. There's many collaborators involved in this. But will the tropical nature reserves function as arcs for biodiversity and also for natural ecological processes? Are the changes in the reserves, if we look at different reserves, are they all changing in different ways, in idiosyncratic ways, or are there common patterns in themes in the way that they're changing? Are they changing in similar ways in many cases? What's driving these changes, and what are the biggest gaps in our knowledge? And so this is an effort, and this is an ongoing study I'm going to tell you about, an effort to try to address some of these issues. First of all, I have to tell you very frankly that this study is just based on bad data. You, of course, know that BAD stands for Best Available Data, which is what we've been doing our best to try to glean from a variety of sources. And we initially tried to look at actual publications of data, and what we found is that there's so much information out there that's just not published. We decided that what we needed to do was to go to experts that have been working for many years within these areas and do very detailed surveys of them. So we're conducting a global survey of 60 protected reserves, 20 each in the African, Asian, and New World tropics. These are all tropical rainforest or woodland. We're focusing on sites that have been better studied. Okay, we didn't feel like we would have a lot of confidence if we go into sites in which there hasn't been much research done. So there's an inherent bias, I suppose, in that we're focusing on places that have been better studied here, and we're trying to really look at changes over the last 20 or 30 years. Now, we don't necessarily expect things to be getting worse because in many cases, these areas have only been designated as reserves in the last 10 or 20 years. So in some cases, we may well expect conditions to be better because they weren't nature reserves before and they've become nature reserves more recently. So that's important to bear in mind. So we're sampling expert knowledge. We're interviewing 4 to 6 experts per site. It's a very detailed, I have to really thank our experts for contributing to this. We have a detailed 6-page questionnaire. We also follow this up with a phone or a face-to-face interview. And we only consider responses that individuals, for every individual question we ask them to rate how much confidence do they have in their response. And unless they say moderate or very high or high levels of confidence in what they're saying, we don't consider their response at all. And there's a whole variety of different kinds of things that we're looking at in terms of our change variables. 35 different ecological features of the reserves we're attempting to get information on. 24 different functional groups of species. These are often referred to as guilds, ecological guilds, which are species that are similar have similar lifestyles. We're looking at 8 groups of invading or disturbance adapted species, 3 different ecological processes, things like forest dynamics is one of those, and 21 different environmental drivers. So I'm just going to hit some of the high points of some of the patterns that we've been finding. And here's the distribution of reserves. You can see that there are some in West Africa, quite a lot in Central Africa, and one down in Madagascar. South Asia, Southeast Asia, and a little bit in some here in Australasia. And then in the New World tropics, Central America, South America, including one in the Brazilian Atlantic forest and one in the Caribbean. So, and sites in the Andes and several sites within the Amazon basin. So that just gives you a sense of the coverage of the sites. First of all, the reserve sizes. Well, there's a lot of variation in terms of the sizes of the reserves. They range from just a little over 100 hectares to well over 6 million hectares. So, but the average is about 400,000, and most of the reserves, about more than 3/4 of the reserves, are over 10,000 hectares in area. So we're not necessarily talking about a lot of real small reserves here. A lot of these or a number of these are larger reserves. But there's a lot of variation, and this is, of course, a logarithmic scale down there. So what I want to first of all talk about are changes in guilds, ecological guilds or functional groups of species. By the way, that's a sign in the central Amazon at an indigenous reserve there. It says, please don't run over the animals, and you can see someone has expressed their opinion about that particular sign. So what I'm going to do here is just walk you through fairly quickly some different groups of organisms, and what we're looking at here is the number of sites in which that group of or guild of species is thought to have increased, that's thought to have had no change, and that's thought to have decreased. And we consider it significant if this decrease here is significantly higher than the number of sites that are increased. In fact, in terms of a null hypothesis, I won't say much about this, but we don't really know what these data would look like if there was no change. You might expect increase and no change and decrease to be about the same, or we might expect no change to be really dominating the values and increase and decrease to be very small. We don't really know what our null hypothesis is, but we do know that if we're getting a strong bias of decreasing over increasing, we're considering that significant, and I can talk about sort of the details of that a bit later. So first of all, apex predators overall, again, there's variation. Some sites they're increasing, some sites they're decreasing, some sites are not considered to be changing, but overall they are declining across more sites than they're increasing. And these are the large dominating predators like jaguars, pumas, harpy eagles, tigers, etc. Large non-predatory species, which include things like cassowaries, tapirs, elephants, rhinoceroses, a lot of other species that might be in forests, are showing an even stronger pattern. You can see here very small p-values. That means it's highly statistically significant. These are declining in many parts, many of the nature reserves in the world. Primates are also declining in many areas. And again, this is over the time scale of the last 20 to 30 years. Now this is a group we actually thought might increase. These are opportunistic omnivores. Oftentimes when you knock out the top predators in an ecosystem, you'll get population explosions of things like coatimundis, and this is a white-tailed rat from Australia. Here's a baboon from Africa. You can get population explosions of medium-sized mammals, generalist mammals that were formerly regulated by those top predators. But in fact, we're seeing that although they do increase in some sites, in other sites they're decreasing, and there was no significant trend overall. Understory birds, this is a group that tends to be very sensitive to habitat fragmentation because they're very specialized for the rainforest understory. Again, significant declines across nature reserves. Of course, at some sites they're not, a number of sites they're not changing, but overall they're declining more than they're increasing when they are changing. Game birds, also almost statistically significant decline here. Of course, these are very vulnerable to hunting. Large frugivorous birds, these tend to require large areas of habitat. They oftentimes need hollow cavities in trees for nesting, and because they rely on a constant supply of fruit, they have to fly from horizon to horizon to find enough food resources, showing a very strong pattern of decline. Stream-dwelling amphibians, all right, we've already had several people who've alluded to the fact that this deadly pathogen, this chytrid fungus, is evidently causing wholesale extinctions of amphibians in some parts of the world, and there's no place reporting an increase in stream-dwelling amphibians, and several places reporting a decrease, so a very strong trend there. In general, aquatic ecosystems don't seem to be faring very well. Look at stream-dwelling fish here. Again, a very strong decline. Many sites reporting declines in stream-dwelling fish populations, very few reporting increases. Migratory species, which of course is a completely eclectic group. It can include many bats and birds and insects in the tropics move up and down elevational gradients at different times of the year in order to find, because there's phenological changes, there's seasonal changes in the availability of fruit and flowers and nectar and resources that they rely on. So they move up and down these elevational gradients. Elephants in Central Africa, for example, forest elephants probably move between inland and coastal areas at different times of the year. Many species of fish in the tropics are migratory. You can see, just generally speaking, migratory species are not doing very well. Things that like disturbance tend to be doing really well in a lot of these reserves here. You can see that the abundances of disturbance and light-loving trees, which include pioneers here like our Cecropia sciatophylla, are doing very well. Thank you very much. As are lianas and vines. These generally like a lot of forest disturbance and a lot of light in the understory. They tend to proliferate their parasites on trees, and so these are also increasing significantly. And just in general, invasive plants, things like kudzu and mimosa and water hyacinth, are doing very well in a lot of these reserves, seeing big increases in invasive species and also big increases in invasive animals. Things like the fire ant, which is problem for a lot of wildlife species. Feral pigs, this bloody great cane toad from tropical Australia are doing very well in many parts of the world. And human diseases are also thought to be increasing for various reasons. For one thing, human populations are increasing also because in general, a lot of the vectors of these diseases, things like mosquitoes, are oftentimes much more common in degraded or modified habitats than they are in primary forests. For example, mosquitoes tend to be about 400 times more abundant in cleared areas than in open areas, and also, of course, potentially from global warming. Many groups are poorly known. So many of the invertebrate groups, bats, a lot of the reptiles and amphibians, we have very poor information on, so I'll just mention that quickly. And then in terms of the drivers, this is kind of surprising to me. So this is in terms of what might be driving these different kinds of environmental changes. First of all, there was no significant change in natural forest cover within the reserve. This surprised me a bit, but I think it's due to the fact that some of the reserves were not reserves when the study began, when we're asking people to look at the last 20 to 30 years. So we're seeing that there's no significant trend there. Some sites are increasing, some sites are decreasing, but no trend overall. Same thing with hunting. It's not statistically significant, although there is some bias towards seeing an increase here. Again, I think the fact that we're getting some reserve designation is helping. No change in fires. This surprised me. Most people are reporting no change in fire frequency. Selective logging is actually declining, and not quite statistically significantly, but I think that this, again, reflects the fact that a number of these sites have become protected areas and so are less vulnerable to things like hunting. And there's some other drivers that are not showing so far, at least in terms of our 170 interviews we've done so far, any change. Illegal mining, grazing, pastoralism, rainfall, river and stream flows, and seed predation are not showing change. Now, here are the things that are showing changes. Air pollution, many sites are reporting an increase in air pollution, many are reporting an increase in water pollution, many are reporting increases in river and stream sedimentation, so that can have a big impact on aquatic ecosystems. Many are reporting rising temperatures, many are reporting increasing droughts. Many are reporting more road construction and also more automobile traffic associated with the reserves. This can be very important because it can provide an influx of various people coming in and modifying the environment. Populations around the reserves are in many cases increasing. So we see a number of sites here reporting increasing human populations. And so, well, what does this all mean? So one possible interpretation, I suppose, is just that the people that we're talking to, which are scientists and environmental scientists, maybe they're just a bunch of Chicken Littles and they just think that the world is going, sort of the sky is falling. But I don't actually think that's probably the case. In fact, I think there's some real patterns and trends in the data. And I'm inclined to believe a lot of what we're finding because we've been very, very careful about the way we've structured the interviews. And some of the main conclusions here, for a lot of the variables that we've looked at, far more of the reserves are getting worse than are getting better. If we look over changes over the last 2 to 3 decades, here's the ones that are getting worse, the percentage of all the reserves we talked about. Here's the ones that are improving for different kinds of environmental variables. You can see the overall trend is definitely one of worsening conditions, not improving conditions. Some of the drivers are stable, or in some cases like logging are actually improving a little bit, but many are worsening. Again, we can see here that a number of these variables are getting worse, being perceived at least as being worse than reserves, and very few are improving. This is something we would just expect, but if you look overall at a composite index of worsening drivers, there's a positive correlation with the worsening guilds. It's just saying that there's internal consistency within the data sets there. Generally speaking, small reserves seem to be declining more. They've got a higher proportion of worsening conditions among the variables we looked at than do larger reserves. You'd expect that, I think. But there's still substantial variation there, and there's clearly other key drivers of degradation that are also important. Rising human population density around the reserves tend to have, what I've got here is the percentage of environmental guilds or ecological guilds that have gotten worse over time. You can see here if you look at reserves that had declining human populations, that you've got a lower percentage than if you've got increasing populations. If you look at declining forest cover, again we see a substantial difference. If you've got declining forest cover within or around the reserve, you're getting a lot more worsening of ecological conditions. And also in particular, one of the strongest factors is proliferating roads. If you're getting more roads within or near the reserves, you're getting a big difference between the environmental conditions. If you're getting a lot of roads, you're getting a big worsening of ecological conditions. So just to conclude, many tropical reserves, our flagships for biodiversity, are being degraded. They're being altered, and oftentimes seriously. Many guilds are declining. Other guilds we just don't have much information on. The threats are generally eclectic. They vary a lot among different reserves, but there are some common threads here. Climate change is perceived as a very common problem, air and water pollution, declining freshwater ecosystems, growing human populations, increasing isolation of the reserves, and in particular, expanding roads seem to be a real problem. And then finally, many reserves just simply seem to be too small and too poorly protected to buffer those ecosystems from the various kinds of external threats and from global climate change. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Bill. And we have one more speaker before we talk about conclusions in the panel, and that's Claudio Valladares Padua. He is a co-founder and vice president of the Institute for Ecological Research in Brazil, and he's had a distinguished academic career, and he's going to talk to us about practical strategies for conservation. Claudio. Change? Okay.
While I'm a Macintosh addict, so while he changed the computer, I will start giving you an introductory remark, a thought that I had when I was coming here by plane, and it's related to an irony of my professional life. I left the business world, a quite successful career in the business world, 30 years ago, or 35 years ago, because I wanted to do conservation. I wanted to dedicate my life to conservation. And the irony is that because I want to do conservation, I'm having to return to the business life. And more. And I'll show you why. In a recent article, Professor Herman Daly, a famous economist here from the University of Maryland, that was one day the head environmental economist of the World Bank, told us that he got a document from the World Bank showing that he had to review as an economist there. And the document has this scheme: economy, inputs, and outputs. And that was all. And that was the definition of economy in the World Bank. So he decided to change it, and he added this. Economy is related to an ecosystem, and the inputs are natural resources, the outputs are pollution and trash. The next time he had to review the document, the chart he has constructed had disappeared. Was not there anymore. So it was very difficult for the World Bank to understand that that was a good definition of economy. Now, on the other hand, as a biologist, I tend to forget that there is business in the economy, that the inputs are used for some things, and the outputs are also important. I'm always looking to ecosystem, natural resources, and how trash and pollution affect us. And if we don't look at both sides, then we might not be successful. And that's, with this view, I started an organization almost 30 years ago, a small organization in Brazil. And the view, naive view, that I could save biodiversity just by studying biology or working with biology. And we were quite successful. the organization grew up. We are now 100 people. We have 12 PhDs. We have 16 masters in our staff. And we are working all over Brazil with a quite substantial budget. And we even developed a model over the time with the change that we thought that were important. And this model has single species biology in the center. And that's because even if we are now moving into working with both worlds, the economy and biodiversity, we have to, as a biologist, I have to remember that biology is important as well. Don't forget my past. So from this, we moved to environmental education, we moved to habitat reconstruction, we work with communities on their needs, on their economy, and landscape, and then we moved to influence policies because some things we couldn't do. All this we do with research and participation. Now, to do that, this model, we had to change our organization. And originally, it was only that, field sites. And then we created this new area related to education and to sustainability. In education side, we have a school for short courses, and we have also a new university only for graduate studies. What we are trying to do is to train the new professional, a professional that thinks much more on a broader way than I thought as a biologist, that could understand that economy is part of the story and other sciences are part of the story. That's why we created this school. And also, we created a unit to deal with business because we are not business people. I mean, I was, but not the group there. And also, we created 2 companies. So it's an NGO that owns 2 companies. One is called Arvorar, and is a company dedicated to ecological restoration, to planting trees and similar things. And the other is called Biofílica, and has as partners some of the most important businessmen in Brazil, and is dedicated to avoid the deforestation, to sell and buy credits of avoid deforestation. And I'll show you how this is working. But, and I'll show how this also interchange with the things we usually do. We have 6 sites we work in Brazil, 2 in the Amazonian, 3 in the Atlantic forest, and 1 in the Pantanal. Today I will concentrate only in our Pará site and the one in the Atlantic forest that we have been running for a long time in the Pontal do Paranapanema. I will start by the Pará one, the Amazonian one. And this is a private farm with more than 100,000 hectares, belongs to a business group, and as many private farms, private ranches in Amazonia, and is covered with forest. This was a dream that a Brazilian businessman had, as Ludwig had with Jari in the past. Many Brazilian business people did that. They thought that they could, in the 70s, when the military were in power, they thought that they could save the world by developing projects in Amazonia. And they all failed because they had no notion of ecology, as Jari failed at the time. The iconic species here is the bush dog. This is a bad picture because it was taken by a camera trap, and Ararajuba, one of the macaws we have. And the model we are working there was developed by Booz Allen and Hamilton, the US-based consultancy company. And the model is not only for that property, but we are developing the model for many similar properties. So this property is just the first step in the direction of a network of privately protected areas in Amazonia that will be funded by carbon credits. And these are the properties, and then we will need to create a series of organizations that will be managing this, because it's very difficult to manage an area of forest in Amazonia, manage to protect and to conserve. This is the new company, Biofílica, and Biofílica is creating a series of funds. With the interest from these funds, we will finance this, and And these are the investors that could be investors in the company or investors in carbon credits. It's a simple model, but it's working. And I think it is competitive. There are now some studies showing that the price, the net present value of carbon credits, even with, when they get a low price, are competitive with many of the other things that are done in the Amazonian forest. Here are different prices of carbon credits compared to sustainable forest products, to cattle ranching, to logging, and other. And it's quite competitive. And also, one of the shareholders of Biotropica, this company, is the former Cargill president in Brazil. So this gives you an idea that if he left Cargill and is investing on that, it's because probably he thinks that's better than soybean. Okay, and this is the property. Now, what we aim is not to create a model for this property, but as I mentioned, is to create a 5 to 10 million hectares network of privately protected areas. And this is important, and especially in this specific moment, because as Bill mentioned, there are many new reserves being created in Brazil, and there were in the past few years, but now less and less, because the governors of the states in Amazonia are completely against the creation of new reserves. So with ARPA, that is a big project that is there, there was a tremendous increase in the creation of protected areas, but this is now flattened. In the last 2 years, there were no reserves created in Brazil, especially in Amazonia. So this tells you the story on how we think that business and carbon and climate change and Brazilian Amazonia can come together in the direction of a better conservation. Now moving to Atlantic Forest. And this is the western part of the state of São Paulo. And I went to this area because many years ago because I wanted to save, my mission was to save this critically endangered species, one of the 4 species of lion tamarins of Brazil, the black lion tamarin. The area was the forest in the last century, mainly at the end of last century, lost most of its forest. And what is left is a state park and some privately owned areas. Some of them were recently gazetted as federal reserve. My plan originally was to save these species, but to do it through research, as I mentioned. And And we developed a research plan, long-term research plan. We did a lot of research, and we gathered a lot of information, and with that, we were able to create an action plan to save the species. And this action plan would require a lot of management. So if we want to save black lion tamarin, we would need to do translocation, reintroduction, manage dispersal, all sorts of management, which is expensive, which is not the best way to do it. Another way to do it, if we could change the landscape to turn it into a more appropriate landscape for black lion tamarins. And we were going in that direction when in the region arrived the landless movement. The landless movement, I think most of you know, is a leftist group that is fighting for agrarian reform in Brazil. They arrived this way, thousands of families. They occupy land, and then they camp and they wait for the government to come and to expropriate the land and distribute. In the first moment, this was a major threat. I was really scared because I thought, well, they are going to go for the forest. But as time went by, we started discussing with their leaders, and we have this, every 2 or 3 years, we have a meeting with all the stakeholders of the region where we discuss the future of the region based on our research. And I ended up having the surprise that all they wanted, they said, well, we don't want to destroy the forest. What we want to do is to reforest. We need to reforest. We need fuel, we need shade, we need a lot of forest. So we could partner with you to do reforestation here. And so we signed an agreement with them to start reforestation there, but not only that, to create a series of economic incentives for them to keep the forest there. And then our business unit is working with them and keep working with them, creating all sorts of products. Small factories are being created, associations of landless groups, and co-ops. We are organizing everything in a way that everybody is benefiting from keeping the forest there. And here we have coffee, we have loofah, we have all sorts of products, forest products, some of them related to endangered species there. And not only that, one of the difficult things when we want to restore a forest is to find seedlings to do that. So we had to create a major area to raise the seedlings. Not only that, a big tree nursery that produces 500,000 seedlings per year. Not only that, there are now 27 community-based tree nurseries selling trees to the reforestation there. This way, but are we planting forests everywhere there? No. We are planting forests, working for the landscape. And then if I want to save lion tamarind, I need to create corridors among the different fragments there. So that we are doing that. And this is one of them. We have now 5 or 6 of them being planted, or already planted. Some of them are coming. Not only that, we are protecting some of the fragments, creating a buffer zone for them. And in this buffer zone, we are using even eucalyptus as a pioneer, as a source of fuel for the communities there too. Eucalyptus as a pioneer coming after eucalyptus we plant other native trees. And this is one of the buffer zones we are creating. We call green hugs. And also where agrarian reform is already established and we cannot do it anymore, we are creating in each small property a small plot of forest. And this way, we're not connecting through corridors, but we are connecting through what we call stepping stones. Small plots of forest where pollinators and dispersers can go from one forest fragment to the other. And I have data showing that this is working. I'm not showing it here because of time constraint. And this is the area, one of the areas close to the park in the year 2000. Agrarian reform came, and then we entered the system, and then now it is like this. And you see all these small plots of forest here and there and there and there, working like stepping stones. And in these plots, what we're doing mainly is coffee and forest. We're not planting coffee on the shade of the forest, but we are planting the forest and the coffee together. And of course, we're looking for varieties of coffee that are good for shade. And not only that, without coffee, their income is negative for these small properties. If we take dairy cattle out, they have negative income. With coffee, they have positive income. So now the problem is, how can there are so many of them that wanted to get involved in the story that we don't have enough resources to help them in getting into the system. Now, not only that, one important thing in Brazilian law requires that 20% of each property is covered with a forest in the Atlantic forest region. Not only that, we wanted to use this law to create a landscape that would be good for everybody. Everybody, I mean for biodiversity, for the people, and for even soil and water and everything. So we did it. We created a map of what we call the dream map of the area. We approved it with the community there. What we are seeing here is just what is mandatory by law. It's nothing special. The special thing is that it's positioned in a way that we want, that is good for the landscape, not in the way the landowner wants. Now, to enforce that, we went to the public attorneys, and said, we have a good map for the region, was approved by the community. You are the one who can help us because this will never be a law. And he said, well, let's call all the decision makers here, and we signed a gentleman's agreement, and it's being implemented. It's being implemented by everybody because they wanted to do it this way, because it's good for them too. And who is funding this? Who is funding this? A large part of it is being funded by the second company, Alvorá, who is selling the carbon credits to mainly to Brazilian companies, but to companies everywhere in Brazil. Last year, we were able to add 212 hectares to the system paid by these companies. Now, to end, just to show how we got involved in the region and how things are going well, one of the jaguars we're studying there, we're also studying jaguars and many other species there. A car of the electricity company ran over and killed a roadkill. And this was very sad to all of us. And the main researcher in this project went to the leader of the landmass, the leaders, and said, oh, I'm very sad, we lost the jaguar. And then he said, well, in this sense, they are like us. We are landless and they are forestless. And we're going to help you. And that's what they did. The way they do things. They closed the road and said, nobody is going to pass here unless the highway authorities come here and help us in developing a plan to avoid this. This is to show you how they got involved in what in the beginning was a major threat, how they got involved in the system, and how they're helping us. And now they are making profit of this as well. So if I had to summarize some results, conservation was incorporated in land use there. Local people were empowered. 27 native tree communities nurseries. Black lion tamarin has been downgraded. It's not critically endangered anymore. There were more than 1,000 small families, small landowners participate in the system. There are new sources of funds coming from carbon. There are conservation and development programs. There are theses, published papers, and so on and so forth. But what is more important is what I said in the beginning. The idea was not to be in one extreme or another extreme. It's to put things together to get a better results so we can win the war and not just only battles as I used to do. Thank you.
Let's see if there are one or two quick questions. Okay, yes, ma'am.
Can you replicate what you're doing in other parts of Brazil? It sounds wonderful.
She's asking if we are replicating that. We are replicating with not the same thing, the same model, but we're using it in different areas of Brazil. The other areas I showed in the map that I couldn't, because of time, I couldn't show here. Yeah.
Any other quick questions for Claudia at this point? Yeah, I'll tell you one anecdote, Claudia, which was interesting. About a few months ago, here in this room, we had a meeting of the Katumba group on payment for ecosystem services and markets. We had about 500 people here talking about ecosystem services. A few of you were here. And one of the things that was most striking to me is there were 20 or 30 investment bankers here in the audience and the panels showing and looking at some of these markets, some of which you mentioned here, and I think we can come back to this in the panel. But it's getting this dialogue between, as you say, the economics and the conservation, the biology that we really need going forward. But we'll come back to that in the panel. Sure. Thank you very much. Muito obrigado. All right, well, it's been a full afternoon of talks, and before we open up for the panel, we're actually going to try and summarize, give you a quick overview of some of the things we've heard, which are some of the main points where there's agreement, and then where are some of the areas where there may not be agreement between some of our speakers. And normally I'd have to do that, but fortunately Joe Wright is going to take a stab at it, and then I'll come in and fill in. So Joe,
Okay.
what have we learned?
We need the other computer.
Oh, we need the other computer. Okay. Just while we get set up, so let me remind you of the dynamic. Joe's going to give us a 5-10 minute overview. No? 6 or 7? No. A short overview. And then we're going to open up for you in the audience to either ask questions, we're going to bring the panel up, all the speakers, but also start a little bit about what do you agree with, disagree with. And at the end, I'm going to come back to each of the speakers and ask them to summarize sort of what's their main take-home message and what did they learn today. If this doesn't start, Joe's going to start tap dancing in a moment.
Yeah. Well, I'm getting this. Bill, would you put that slide that shows me throwing you out of the ring?
Yeah, would you like to try that while we wait?
You shouldn't have turned the computer off, my goodness.
Okay.
There. Great. Thank you. Well, I get the final word. I thought at this point of the talk, you might not have, at this point of our session, you might not have a clear picture of where we agree and where controversy remains. So I'm just going to identify those points. We all agree that habitat loss, direct persecution, and climate change are the greatest threats facing biodiversity in the tropics. Liz talked about direct persecution. It's hitting the larger species, the charismatic species. It's occurring inside reserves and protected areas. There's several hundred species that are threatened with global extinction in the tropics today. It's the biggest species and the most charismatic species. We all agree that global warming is going to bring novel climates to a very large portion of the tropical forests that exist today with unforeseeable consequences, and that there's already extinctions that are being caused by global warming. We also all agree that there's a tremendous amount of forest loss, and it varies tremendously geographically, from more than 90% in places like Salvador, Madagascar, Haiti, Ivory Coast, to less than 10% in places like Gabon and northern South America. We also all agree that the rates of land use change are accelerating in the tropics. There's forest being cut down, forest being logged, and secondary forest coming back, and it's happening at an accelerating rate. What we disagree about is the consequences for numbers 4 and 5, and that's where the points of controversy are. And I would identify 4 points of controversy that remain among this group after our workshop and putting together this special feature that we're putting together for conservation biology. How much tropical forest is going to remain in the future? What's the conservation value of altered forests, logged and secondary? What are the implications of forest change for extinction? That's where we began this debate with extinction. And how effective are tropical nature reserves? And I'm going to devote a couple of minutes to the first and the fourth one of those. This is why I wrote the original article. I've lived in Panama for 25 years now and traveled widely throughout the tropics, and I saw a real disconnect between the tropical biology, conservation biology literature, And its predictions, which are summarized in this paper by my good friend Rodolfo D'Urso that Bill mentioned earlier, which predicts that only 5 to 10% of tropical forest will remain in 2050. And what I saw happening on the ground, which was a whole lot of secondary forest coming back. Yes, primary forest was being lost, but there was secondary forest everywhere I went. So we went through the exercise that Bill outlined in this first talk of using the UN population projections to predict that somewhere between 32 and 36% of forest would actually be left. And we started a firestorm. As Bill said, there have been 24 papers criticizing us. The very first one came out as a companion paper with our article. Barry Brook and his associates proposed a business as usual model. They claimed that the deforestation rates that we had seen in the recent past would, if they continued into the year 2050, realize this prediction of 5 to 10% of forest remaining. They proposed a model that's very simple. You have a deforestation rate that's assumed constant. That's the business as usual assumption. You have an initial amount of forest. If you're an investment banker, you might recognize this as the compound interest problem. Although your interest rate is negative, which your interest rate may well be these days in the United States, you can project forward 50 years very easily if you can have an estimate of the forest cover at time zero and the deforestation rate. Papers that have been mentioned earlier today by several speakers provided exactly those data, the deforestation rates for the 1990s and forest cover in about the year 2000. You work through the equation, you end up with 41 to 42% of forest remaining, actually a third higher than we'd predicted. It's very revealing because it shows the conservation biologists have the impressions that don't quite fit with their data. There's been one other estimate that Christian mentioned this morning. He was one of the participants in this, and I would never do anything to detract from Christian, but he was one of 1,700 participants that produced this Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. It included economists, social scientists, biologists, climatologists. They attempted to do the most difficult of all things, which would be to model human behavior of individuals, corporations, and governments. They modeled 4 scenarios, which they gave names. It included all possible drivers of forest loss, population, economics, culture, technology, climate change, invasive species. Everything is mixed in. And they predicted somewhere between a low estimate of 39 to 45% of forest would remain in the year 2050, even higher. Their techno-garden has aggressive adaptation of oil palm and other biofuels, but leads to a very high level of forest being predicted to be left. So my answer is there's still controversy. How much forest is going to remain? Well, the literature, like the conservation literature, often reports this number, but attempts to do estimates and projections into the future with repeatable methods are giving a very different number. I'm not going to say anything about numbers 2 and 3. Robin talked about number 2. I believe, many of us believe that altered forests have substantial conservation value. The literature tends to report minimal, even no values, 0 value. If you go to the website for the hotspots, the Conservation International hotspot, and read the first page that comes up, it's clear that there's an implicit assumption there that only the original vegetation has any conservation value. No other part of the landscape has any conservation value whatsoever. Nigel Stork talked about the implications of forest change for extinction. We believe it's highly variable. You can't extrapolate from large-bodied species to small-bodied species. Much of the conservation literature bases projections on a uniform sort of loss and does make that extrapolation. I want to devote a few minutes to nature reserves. How effective are tropical nature reserves? This is really the second reason I started out on this enterprise. I haven't written anything about it yet. I produced this diagram from the World Database on Protected Area for a paper that I'm doing with Tom Brooks. And it just shows in the histogram, well, you can break this question down into 2 questions. The first is the area protected sufficient to protect nature? The blue histogram is the total area in strict nature reserves. This is IUCN categories 1 to 4 only. These are the reserves that are restricted to nature. No human extraction, no human cultural influences, strict nature reserves only. And you'll notice that the absolute area protected is very high in the tropics. Reserves as a percent of all land area is actually higher in the tropics than it is anywhere else, except in the far frozen north of the temperate zone where agriculture is impossible, so people tend to set up nature reserves. In land where agriculture can potentially occur, there's no place except the tropics with that amount of land set aside. These governments, these people have made a massive investment in trying to preserve their biodiversity, an investment that's not matched anywhere else. The second part of the question is, are individual reserves effective? This is a picture from this article. There have been about 5 or 6 articles now that do global surveys that involve 100 or more reserves, and they generally come up with the conclusion that yes, they are effective. This is a reserve in the Atlantic coastal forest in Brazil. This is the boundary of the reserve. Inside there's forest, outside there's agriculture and towns and people. The reserve is working. We did a global analysis using MODIS satellite data. This is an instrument mounted on 2 different satellites. It covers the entire planet once or twice every day, and it automatically detects every fire. That's 3 years of fire records for the Republic of Panama, where I live, superimposed on the country's system of national parks. For every reserve in every rainforest reserve in the world, over 800 of them, we calculated the fire density inside the park and inside a buffer area immediately around the park. And this histogram compares those fire densities just by differencing them. On this side, the fire density is lower in the reserve and greater in the buffer area. On this side, the fire density is greater in the reserve, and you can see that the vast majority, well over 600 of the 800, are falling over here. There are definitely exceptions. They're occurring in countries where Transparency International suggests corruption is very high. They're occurring in countries where the Human Development Index of the UN is very low and poverty is very high. So poverty and corruption are compromising some reserves, but generally tropical rainforest reserves are effective at excluding fire. And that's the general conclusion of all of these papers. So there's our points of controversy, that paper park syndrome that you often see in the literature versus data that I believe shows that these reserves are generally successful. The bottom line is that we still disagree about the threat habitat loss poses for tropical diversity. It's no doubt it's a huge threat in Madagascar. It's a huge threat in El Salvador. It's a huge threat in Haiti. But it's not a general pan-tropical threat. There's many places that it's not a big threat. Some of us believe that climate change is a much greater threat. And this has policy implications. If you accept the idea that the party responsible for a problem should help to solve it. So what are our 3 big threats? Hunting, habitat loss, and climate change. Who's responsible? Well, you know, the market might be in New York, the consumer might be in Paris, but ultimately it's the local people and government who let things happen inside their own national territory. So ultimately they're responsible for hunting and habitat loss. The solution is reserves and regulation. Liz and Claudio have shown us how reserves and regulations work. And we've seen there's a massive effort in these countries to attempt to solve these problems. Our third problem, climate change, the responsible party is very different. It's the United States. It's the people in this room. Very recently, it's become China, the European Union, other developed nations. This adds up to about 70% of global CO2 emissions, global greenhouse emissions from fossil fuels. We're the ones who are responsible. What's the solution going to be here? Well, conservation biologists talk about mitigation, which means preventing climate change through reducing emissions. and the Bali negotiations that will lead to the successor of the Kyoto Protocol. There have been negotiations open for the first time to allow cash payments to protect carbon stock in forests, the sort of thing that Claudio just told about that he's making happen in Brazil. But it's just now on the table for discussion. The other thing that conservationists talk about is adaptation, which is how do we rescue biodiversity in the face of climate change? What are we going to do? It's going to require something besides the national parks and reserves that we now have. We're going to have to take a huge landscape approach. We're going to have to link warm, hot lowland areas to cooler montane areas to give species the ability to move to cool refuges in the future. People are even proposing that we're going to have to help them move. We're going to have to be massively moving species around. We need research to decide whether or not that's even going to be a good idea, moving species like that. It's going to be very expensive. Claudio just gave us a wonderful example that's happening in Brazil with Brazilian resources. But it's on the pan-tropical scale, it's going to be a hugely expensive thing. Brazil is one of the wealthiest countries in the tropics. Many tropical countries are not going to be able to do this, and these countries are going to have to help. But it's something that's not even being discussed now. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Joe, for that quick summary and for pushing us on some of these issues. Now we're going to move on to our panel and questions. So I'd like to ask their panelists to come up, and there are a couple of tables which we'll pull out, and I think some chairs. While they set up, let me just start by thanking our speakers for a whole diversity of issues that have been brought up today. You know, two things that didn't come up today, which are kind of interesting, and that I'm always an optimist about the future, despite all of these challenges. One of them is the capacity to actually change human behavior. And I actually think that we can respond as a society. And to address some of the issues that we saw right now, I think it is going to be changing our attitudes and the things that we do. And the second is the ability of some of these species and some of these elements to adapt to the change. And I think that's something that clearly the challenge here is the scale, the rate of change and the ability over short periods of time to have changes. But even out there, we have good examples of a number of species that have adapted. And most of the scenarios and most of the things that we've looked at assume a constant rate of adaptation, a constant rate of both by species and by humans. I think it's something we may want to explore a little bit further. While we finish setting up, a couple other things that I was looking at, sort of if I had to look at elements here. I think we saw some good examples about some response options related to issues like setting areas aside, potential landscape management, wildlife and timber trade, and others. And Joe mentioned that there was nothing being done about adaptation. I think there's certainly a little bit of that being discussed, not at the scale of mitigation. And those of you that follow the climate change negotiations are probably well aware that there is a possibility now, there's a decision at Bali to introduce forests into the equation. Deforestation will be one of those areas. And there's no doubt the recent estimates by investment bankers and others said that the markets for carbon are going to be huge. But the other thing that's coming clear is that the majority of the responses are going to relate to energy efficiency. And exactly how much of this can actually turn into conservation is still up for debate. And just at the recent meeting that happened in Poland about 1 month ago, there was debate about setting up an adaptation fund. In the end, there was disappointment by many developing countries because the total amount of funds devoted was just in the tens of millions of dollars, which is not going to solve the issue. But at least there's some issues there, and there's a number of people here that have been key players in some of these issues and negotiations. So we got our speakers. Could we have a little bit more light here so we can see their faces? Maybe? And while we get that, I'd like to call on a couple people in the audience just to get this rolling. I'm going to start by Tom Lovejoy, who's right here and who's, of course, his name was mentioned several times today in terms of some of his studies. And if we could just give Tom a mic. But also, he's been one of the people that's been writing a lot about biodiversity and climate change over the years. So, Tom, what are your thoughts? What are your either any questions, but also very importantly, your own reflections about what's missing?
Well,
what's the future?
Just to start with, I do want to congratulate Joe and Bill and all the speakers for a wonderfully rich program about the complexities of this topic. And it was particularly good to have it end with Claudio's showing how much you really can do and reaching out to parts of society we haven't particularly reached out to in the past. So, you know, as we talk about these things, it's very easy just to always sort of almost seem a little defensive because we're always trying to take on the latest problem. And in a sense, and I do not mean to trivialize it by saying, in a sense, having a debate as to what's going to get the biggest hit for tropical biodiversity, is it habitat loss or climate change, is not thinking as big as I think we need to think. And if you think about what climate change means for biodiversity for the whole planet, in that 20% of the greenhouse gas emissions every year come from tropical deforestation, obviously trying to get that under control and lower that amount of emissions is hugely important. But I think we need to go way beyond that. And the estimate is, and I think it's an underestimate, that tropical or terrestrial ecosystems have lost maybe 200 billion tons of carbon in the last 300 years. And we also have the additional problem that once a molecule of CO2 is in the atmosphere, it stays there for 100 to 1,000 years. So we only know one way to pull it out quickly, and that's biology, and in the case of tropical forests, it's reforestation. So I think what we need to do these days in tackling climate change, in addition to the energy agenda, is literally think about re-engineering or engineering the planet with ecosystems to pull out as much of that carbon as we can. And if we do that and we essentially regreen the emerald planet, we're not only doing some mitigation about climate change, but we're also making all those ecosystems more able to adapt to the climate change that will come.
Tom, let me use that as a jumping platform to pose a question here to the panel, because I think the issue of potential capture by carbon in these forests is important. And the mature forests are not going to do it. It's going to be the reforestation, but potentially some of these regrowth areas as well. So I want to ask Robin, since you've been working on these issues, can you address this issue a little bit about growth rates in these different kinds of forests in the landscape and the potential in terms of capturing carbon?
Yes, there is a huge potential for young secondary forests in particular to capture carbon. I think even at the level or more of plantations. So, but I think that we should also supplement this with types of tree plantations that will also draw biodiversity rather than detract from biodiversity. So we saw some data from eucalyptus plantations. They're not so great. Oil palm plantations, they're not so great. There are other alternatives for planting trees. And we need to really explore new alternatives, including native species, including combinations of native species, including planting native species into secondary forests that may not be developing as quickly as they could because of problems of other seeds not getting dispersed. So I really think we should kind of be very open to new forests that we can manage that will help to mitigate some of the carbon dioxide problems at the same time while providing habitats for biodiversity. I don't think they have to be in conflict.
All right. Let's see if we have some questions, follow-up questions on the issues today, or comments. If you've made comments, I'd like to ask you to keep them short so that we can accommodate as many as we can. What I'd like to do is ask, when you are going to make your question or comment, just let us know who you are. I think that would be helpful for all of us. Johnny, you have a mic there, and we have someone. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Joe Teeger, and I'd just like to respond to a kind of a question and a comment that was asked earlier, Dr. Riddell. Quote, mining effects are local. Mining effects used to be local. Industrial scale mining is a satellite level activity, by which mean many of today's mines can be seen from space. Almost every country mentioned here today has large scale hard rock mining. These mines are so large, and they release millions of tons of waste into freshwater ecosystems. Many metals today are extracted with acid extraction, particularly gold, a combination of cyanide and acid. Many of these wastes are released to river systems. You have air emissions from smelters. The most toxic community in the world today is in South America from a lead smelter. How long do these local impacts last? Well, first you have mining today happening on this scale from the Neo-Arctic to the tip of South America. So these local impacts on a global scale are quite significant. And you have instant extinction of freshwater ecosystems when these mines go into operation and the dumping of their waste into river systems. And when these river systems are filled with sediment and the waters change, they deforest areas and destroy communities as well. There is an article I have at home which talks about which was from some archaeologists in Iran who were investigating a site of copper mining where the mining was done by the Romans 2,000 years ago and had toxic levels of arsenic to this day. Industrial scale mining contributes to everything you're talking about here today, including global warming, high uses of energy to produce the metals, quote, local scale extinctions of entire river systems, and the destruction of native communities.
All right. Thank you for that. Let's see. Yes, sir. Just tell us who you are.
My name is Lee. Several of you may have mentioned the exploding human population. So what are your solutions for that?
All right. Who'd like to take that one on?
Personal or global?
Bill?
Well, I mean, the population issue, of course, it's about the most controversial issue you can talk about, but I mean, family planning and increased education for women. I mean, these are pretty much regarded as the main, there's a phrase that demographers use called the demographic transition, and it's a transition between a population where you've got very rapid population growth and an age distribution strongly biased towards lots of young people and typically a lot of instability. In fact, there's very strong correlations between rapidly growing countries and political and military instability. Lots of young, disenfranchised males tend to push these populations into unstable social situations. Family planning and education for women. And I'm just, one thing I'd say, it's for me, it's propitious to be having this right before the inauguration of a new president. You know, the previous administration, the second day of their administration, gutted United States support for international family planning programs. And so there's real policy implications for this type of thing.
I see a couple of the panelists that want to speak. Claudio, do you want to address that?
I was going to mention education in general. I mean, we have to make, if we want to change the world for the better, we have to make a huge investment in education in the world, right? All over the world. We have to help countries that cannot educate their people. Education is the base of everything. But also we have to mention that overpopulation is not the only problem. Overconsumption is a problem too.
Okay, Tom.
A couple of comments. Basically, I think we're actually making more progress on the population part of the consumption equation than in other areas. But to give you an example, Brazil is currently at below replacement fertility. It's at a lower average fertility rate than the United States. So there's been a tremendous change in the past 20 years in terms of average fertility rates in the developing world. And I think that Claudio is exactly right in terms of pointing to education, in particular the education of women, as probably the most efficient way to bring those fertility rates down.
Okay, just to follow up on that, and Claudia mentioned it quickly, I think the other dimension may not be just the number of people. The various population scenarios do suggest somewhere between 8 and 10 billion people, so there's still some more to come. But the issue is what the consumption patterns are going to be for those 8 or 10. Right. So one issue I'd add beyond the education has to do with technology transfer. And the fact is that we can really have to empower these people to get to a standard of living that depends on different use of natural resources. And the good news is there are many of these things that we have, and the issue is transferring them faster and quicker so that they can get to the standards of living. Let's see other questions. Yes, sir.
Bill McShay. Just to follow up on this question, there's also the question of people shifting from rural to urban environments, and that take the pressure off of these reserves, but urban people eat too, and I don't know if they're more efficient at their food production or it's people are people, and if the population goes up, there won't be the release that Joe and others are predicting.
Okay. Okay, Joe's quiet, so I'm going to, if you want to mention anything on that, since this is exactly what the basic element in your model.
So one of the population growth rate is, I'm glad Tom put in what he said because that's exactly what I was going to say, is going down much more rapidly than's been expected. And one of the reasons is that people in cities have fewer children than people out in the countryside. So that alone is going to further, it's a positive feedback that's going to further reduce population growth rates. People move to the city, they have fewer children. Do they continue to eat? Sure they do. But when they're in the countryside with a small finca, they're typically on the margins of society, they're on marginal agricultural land, and as you suggested, their efficiency tends to be very, very low. When they move to the city, they're buying food from agro-industry, which has a much higher efficiency. The land they've abandoned back in the countryside on marginal land, far from the road network, on high topographic relief terrain, goes back to secondary forest and is likely to stay there. But this is one of the great unknowns that we need a lot more data before we'll really know the answer.
Christian, can I just follow up quickly?
Just very briefly, because I want to make sure we have.
I think this is an important point that needs to be emphasized, and Tom Riddell touched on this. You know, one of the key, and this is in the spirit of debate, one of the really crucial assumptions of the Wright model is this very strong relationship between population size and how much forest you've got. But because the drivers of deforestation, it's not just population, but because the drivers of deforestation are becoming so much more globalized and so much more industrial, this in many ways I think is delinking this traditional relationship between how many local people you have and how much forest destruction you're having. For example, in the Republic of Congo, you don't need very many people there to really wipe out a lot of that country's forests when China is buying every stick of timber that's coming out of the country, which is happening now. So this globalization is having a very important impact, and I think that I am far less convinced and sanguine, and also biofuel expansion. Tropics is where things grow fastest, it's where land is cheapest, it's where we're going to see most of the biofuel expansion going on. The pressures on land are not going to diminish, in my view. I believe the pressures are going to continue, and I am far less optimistic about this idea that we're going to see a regreening of a lot of these landscapes. I think the pressures are going to continue into the future.
All right. Let's see. Johnny? Yeah. Yes, sir.
Scott Moride, the New York Botanical Garden. Question for Joe Wright. Joe, I had a student ask me, with the global warming taking place, the glaciers are going to melt and there's going to be more water, so this will be good for the rainforest. Can you help me answer that question?
All right, Joe.
Well, NASA has produced a wonderful data set, a 29-year record of all land-based measures and all satellite measures of precipitation. And it shows a large increase in precipitation globally over that 29-year period. It's something the global climate models have not predicted. They don't do a very good job with precipitation. That increase is almost entirely over the tropical oceans. The change over land is zero, it's negligible. There's some places with small increases, other places with small decreases. A significant decrease across the Sahel, the northern limit of forest in tropical Africa, but elsewhere it's a wash at this point, and the global climate models just don't capture what's happening. But right now we have and it makes sense. What's happening is the oceans are getting warmer, and as they get warmer, they evaporate more water, and there's more water vapor in the atmosphere. It's going to come down somewhere. So far, it's coming down mostly over the warmest tropical oceans.
Okay. Yes.
Manon Davis, a volunteer here. Thank you for the repeated discussion of carbon sequestration. But the other half of the quotient is, what's obvious to us, is the production of oxygen. And this needs to be part of the education quotient globally. Now, isn't this all a major part of climate change, losing the forest, losing the oxygen production, as well as the carbon sequestration? Thank you.
Joe?
So carbon dioxide is about 380, 390 parts per million in our atmosphere. Oxygen is about 21% of the atmosphere. It's a very different number. Human activities have caused a 30% increase already in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Human activities are not going to dent the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere. About 70% of the oxygen is being evolved in the oceans, not over land. So I don't think we really need to be worried about oxygen concentrations in the atmosphere. It's a very different scale between carbon dioxide and oxygen.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Yes, William Dunn of Natural Partners. I know that there's a lot of deforestation that takes place outside of protected areas, but within protected areas, presumably there could be more done to keep the degradation of the forest from happening, the hunting that goes on, the loss of the species. And I did hear Claudio Padua speak and give a very good case example of what can be done and actively working with local communities to achieve better management practices. But I'd like to hear from the other panelists in terms of what they see as potentially that can be done to implement better management of protected areas that often are paper parks. They exist on paper, but very little is done in practice. For lack of presence, for lack of perceived economic value by the local communities, et cetera.
Okay, let's open up and see who would like to comment. Anyone? Robin?
I certainly think that in many areas, buffer zones around reserves could be used much more productively by local peoples in ways that will provide many of their needs, so that removes some pressure from harvesting products in the forest. And I think that we can build from that, from those buffer zones out, in rings, sort of concentric rings as time goes on, to diversify the kinds of products that are being grown.
Okay, any others? Elizabeth?
It seems to, going back to corruption and forest fires, it seems to me one of the important things that could be done is try to reduce the amount of illegal logging, which oftentimes has what precedes that are various kinds of corrupt deals. And what that means, amongst other things, is a change in the amounts of money that are paid civil servants and changes in the norms about the performance of official duties. I think that would bring a significant reduction in the numbers of paper parks in the world.
Elizabeth, please.
One of the things that also could be done to improve things is to get the right players involved in management, because across the tropical world managing tropical forests is incredibly difficult. You can't see when poachers are there, you can't see when people are coming in, you can't see what's going on. And so governments are almost never going to have the resources to put in enough people to manage them properly. And so it's going to be much more a question of changing the model by which we think about it to involve a much wider range of players, particularly local communities, but them on their own, again, can't do it. They often don't have the legal authority to manage. They often don't have the technical skills to manage within today's complex world with all the pressures. So it's getting the right suite of players working together with the right legal and management authority to do it.
Okay.
Bill? Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said, and I would just add one other thing. There's enormous challenges in protecting a lot of these reserves in the tropics, as Liz and Tom and Robin have said. There's financial limitations, there's logistical limitations, there's issues of corruption. I think one of the most practical realities, whenever it's possible, is to really limit road access. And there's roads in reserves, when there's roads around reserves, you just open up a Pandora's box, and it just becomes extremely difficult to keep the demons inside.
I guess I would add one quick thing, which is, of course, as we look at these reserves, especially in montane areas and others, responding to changes in climate change and others is going to require designing them differently, including corridors and other areas, and that will be particularly true in some areas, and that's what we're starting to see. Okay, let's...
I'd add something.
Oh, Joe?
I agree with everything everybody said. I would just add, there's been a very nice study. I can't remember the authors. They did a survey of the investment in reserves. How much does it cost per unit area to maintain reserves? And they corrected it for differences in purchasing power parity, differences in the value of currencies between countries. And in the developed world, it worked out to about $2.50 per hectare per year to maintain reserves. In the developing world, in other words, the tropics that we're talking about, it was about half that level. About $1.20 per hectare per year is being invested in reserves. We're asking the poorest countries in the world to solve this biodiversity threat. You know, two-thirds to three-quarters of all species are in the tropics, and we're asking the poorest countries in the world to do this by themselves. The eventual solution is going to have to involve more financial resources for those reserves, and it's going to have to come from the wealthy countries in the world.
Okay, Nigel? Last of this round, and we'll come back to the audience.
I just want to add a couple of new perspectives on this, and I want to relate it to the part of the world where I now live, in Australia and Papua New Guinea. In Papua New Guinea, all the land is owned by the people. There is no such thing as federal land or state land. So any kinds of changes that you want have got to be actually at the grassroots level by the communities there. So it's, I think, quite different to many other countries. That's one thing. Okay, then take Australia. Australia is the size of the US, but only 20 million people, 21 million. Once you get outside the major cities, you're talking about a trickle of people. I'm currently involved in, I'm chairing a committee for the Queensland government, which is looking to try and create Cape York as a World Heritage Area. Now, Cape York, gosh, I suppose it's a couple of your major states put together, all right? But the population is probably less than 50,000 people. So, yes, we could turn the whole lot into reserves and take away the grazing leases that are there. But then the management problems become colossal. Because who's there to manage all the feral animals and so on? At least the farmers there for grazing are actually doing a lot of those controlling. So, and then at the same time, involvement of the local indigenous people is incredibly important. But it's only recently that we've actually had a government that's actually formally apologized for all the atrocities that have happened to the Aboriginal people. So there's huge social issues to do with that as well. So these things, you know, there's no one-size-fits-all answer to some of these problems. And we tend to look at some parts of the world and think that's where the solution is. Maybe Brazil, because they're doing interesting things there, but it's going to be different in other parts of the world.
Okay, thank you. Let's go back to the audience for other comments or questions. Yes, sir.
Peter Griffith. This is a question maybe for Claudio. One of the most frightening things, disturbing things I saw in Brazil in 2008 was the brand new fleet of municipal buses in Campinas in São Paulo state with signs very proudly proclaiming that they were all fueled on biodiesel produced from soy. The soy expansion in Brazil historically really hasn't been driven by biofuel production, and this is kind of a new development. And so my question, Claudio, is there something comparable to what the, in Brazil, to what the California Air Resources Board is doing with low carbon transportation fuel requirements to look at the full life cycle of transportation fuels and require some sort of carbon accounting?
I don't know if there are people in this group that might be able to answer this better than I do. What I can say is that we've been working with biofuel for many, many years now. And I'm not completely against biofuel produced from sugarcane, provide that we can, which is a difficult thing, that we can control the expansion of the frontier of biofuel in agriculture. That does not enter in the forest, but use the land that is there, pasture land or sugarcane. We now have some studies showing for wildlife is more or less the same. I don't know, I'm not the best person to answer, maybe, yeah.
Sorry. Okay, I'm not seeing anyone volunteering, so.
Well,
right.
I just, I'm not an expert on this particularly either, but I do work in a faculty at the university which has a very strong agricultural background too. And my understanding is that the changes in fossil fuels are reducing the actual backlogs now, the supplies that we have of some of the major grains as well. So it is becoming a real issue, and it's something that I know a lot of people are thinking about.
Okay, let's come back down to the audience. Yes, in the back.
Hi, Wrightâs Energy Management Services. When I was listening to Laurance's wonderful talk on deforestation, I was thinking about similar programs which were very successful in moderate climate countries like Russia and China in the 60s and 70s. And the goal was not to create biodiversity, the goal was to improve agriculture and increase the productivity. So by planting streams around the rivers, we would do water retaining, drought resistance, and biodiversity was a wonderful consequence of these state-funded programs. So if you look at Google Map now, you can see strips connecting to water basins. You can see the country crisscrossed by these strips. So I wonder if in tropical countries there could be found such factors which would be more attractive for the governments of those countries, which would motivate them to invest into reaching these goals, like improving their agricultural output. And secondary forest and biodiversity would be a wonderful side effect of this. So did anybody connect to the larger?
Okay. I think it's a comment.
Could you give us the question again? We couldn't hear the question. We haven't heard the question.
Do you want to comment on it at all in some ways?
Well, simply that increasing agricultural productivity can also be beneficial in its own right, and can also, if done in ecologically sustainable methods, can also enhance biodiversity. Was that your main point?
Just move the mic a little bit closer.
Can't hear you.
Yeah, how
Can't
to
hear a thing.
switch the goal from achieving biodiversity, which is good for the whole planet, but not so obvious for people in a local area, to improving the productivity of their particular fields, which would motivate them more than achieving abstract goals. That was the question. How to turn it into the economic issue versus a global issue.
Okay.
Well, I'd jump in. So productivity, agricultural productivity has increased steadily since the 1930s, and the developed world is realizing a higher agricultural yield per hectare than the tropical world, than the developing countries. But the tropical countries are catching up, and as agricultural productivity goes up, we'll be able to provide food for more people, more consumption. There's potential there to absorb part of the increase in population, but not all of it. So agricultural productivity is increasing, and it still has quite a ways to go in the tropics. It's about 20 years behind the developed world, but on the same trajectory.
Just to add to that, in the Millennium Assessment, what we found was that between 1960 and the year 2000, human population doubled from 3 billion to 6 billion, so 200% increase. But agricultural productivity increased 250% during the same period of time. So it outpaced population growth. The issue is the distribution of that growth among countries. And the real crisis is happening in places like Africa, of course. Okay, Len?
Thank you, Len Hirsch. If pulling things together, if the type of fragmentation that's going on, even if it's only 60% disappearing, which to me sounds like a lot in an ecosystem, reduces resilience and creates a number of unintended consequences, invasive species, edge effects. What's the likely tipping point with climate change? I mean, Joe, you sort of scared me in some of your curves there that, to me, if I put that together, some of the solutions says that they're dead. Tropical forests, we are not going to be here in 100 years, given the already existing climate change that we've pumped into the atmosphere. So should we be reforesting? Should we be looking at what is a very different transformational system? Are there any models of this? I mean, Libya, perhaps, once forested, no longer. So I'm sort of worried about how does this all accumulate, and are there tipping points and dangers that we really need to be figuring out how to create an observational network so that we see them before we've tipped.
Joe, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I hope I didn't create too big a scare. What we're going to see is I believe with climate change, what we're going to see is we're going to have forests, but in a novel climate, a novel combination of rainfall and temperature, because the temperatures are going to be higher. The rain's not going to go away, so we're not going to have the aridity, the drought that we now have at places on the planet's surface that are 28 and 29 degrees mean annual temperature. Instead, we're going to have a vast area where the mean annual temperature is going to be 28, 29, 30, 31, but we're going to have 2 meters of rainfall, 3 meters of rainfall. I think we're still going to have forest, but we don't know what that forest is going to look like. The species composition is going to be radically different. Many species are going to be losers, probably a few will be winners, but strong forces of species interactions and negative density dependence will stabilize those communities. But they're going to be extremely different than they are now, and we just don't know, we have no way to predict what they're going to look like.
Okay, let's take one more here. Very briefly, one more question, then we're going to come to closing comments.
I've recently heard from other people I've talked to, people who came back from Poznan, that the tipping point is believed to be 480 parts per million of CO2 and a couple of degrees warming. That's what I was told. If that's true, then we really can calculate just how much CO2 we can afford to be putting up in the next 10, 20, 30 years. And we should be able to be estimating how much we should be releasing and distributing that between the major distributors in the world. I have to say, I'm just astonished at how slow these discussions are going. But it is so incredibly vital at this I've also talked to other people who say basically it's getting too late. We are faced with these 5 and 6 degrees warming, and that will mean massive changes. So I'm very, very pessimistic about it.
We don't leave here pessimistic, we leave here optimistic. Yes, last comment.
I'm George Watson. We've heard from Claudio about grassroots sociology, and we've heard from Elizabeth what I would call low-level political action. What about the global political scene, particularly the turmoils throughout the Middle East and in Africa that have had some very strong conservation problems associated?
All right. Anyone want to, Tom, you want to take this on? Go for it.
Well, this may take me to what I was going to say when Christian was to ask us, you know, what we took away from the conference. But one of the really important questions I think that Claudio's presentation raised was, this is a demonstration project. It's wonderful to listen to it. The question then becomes, okay, how do we make this sort of thing repeat itself, spread? And there are other people out there talking about demonstration projects that they've engaged in, and the same question comes up. How do you make this thing propagate so that it really becomes a norm? And I think one of the questions, I think the point is, and this goes to your question, is that one needs political change at larger scales in order to get the kind of environment that really makes these demonstration projects replicate rapidly and produce the carbon sequestration that we need. So I think you're very right to raise those sorts of questions as being an important part of this discussion.
Okay. We probably don't have all the right mix of people to address it, but it is a very important question, George. I guess one of the comments I would make, which is pretty striking to this, we think of where we are at this moment in history in the United States, with our ability to respond to what's been a major change in the economy, the downturn and others. You can actually see that sometimes you need a crisis to actually generate a response. And what I certainly hope is that some of these changes and some of these patterns that we're seeing in more of these data, and yes, the polar bears, which capture people's imaginations and others, will help us generate some of this, because I think what we need, personally, is a tipping point in society in the way we approach this. And I'm hopeful that we will get there, and we will continue working to try and help with this. I'm going to do a quick round of closing comments, and I want to volunteer a couple of people here in the audience as well, just to comment on what their takeaway messages are. Where's the microphone? Chuck, do you have one? Would you bring one to Ira, please? Because Ira Rubinoff, as I mentioned before, was one of the people that when he was acting Undersecretary for Science, instigated this symposium, and he's been sitting very quietly here now that he's got a beard and a new look. And I want to ask him, what's your takeaway from what you've heard this afternoon, Ira?
Christian likes to draft me for things.
Coming that way. Coming that way. Careful, guys.
Now that I have the microphone, I want to thank
just tilt it.
Joe. Can you hear it?
Yeah, just tilt
I want to thank Joe and Bill for taking on this project, and I think it's been, I'm very pleased what I've heard here today. What I heard in Panama a few months ago. I also want to thank Peggy and Steve for their support in pushing us to do this. There are a couple of observations that are sides to this I want to mention. People were very much surprised that there would be a controversy of this order of magnitude inside a single organization. And I think a lot of people didn't understand how science is done, and they felt that these people we ought to have a vote to see whether their forests are increasing or decreasing diversity, or we should perhaps have the director call them in and put them right on this controversy. And so I think that's a side of this, that really this is how science moves. But I also want to think about what would happen if we're here 50 years from now looking at the same question. And Claudio raised these economic issues, and I think this is a very good time to think about that. We're talking about economics and we're talking about ecology. They're both sciences. They're both supposed to be able to predict the future, given when you plug in a few a certain amount of data. We have problems with our economy, and we are prepared now to put in billions, maybe even trillions, into failed automobile companies and failed financial institutions to solve their problems. But the ecologists have to predict where our water is going to come from, where our food's going to come from, what our air is going to be like. And I no way or nowhere do I see any effort to say that when 50 years from now we're sitting here, we're going to have data sets. And it's not going to rely on the kinds of things that Bill is having to do to ask people, what was it like? And oh yeah, there used to be more trees here. We need to have data. We're going to have to predict what's going on in this planet. We better start studying it and making these long-term observations. That's my side take of this.
Okay, thank you. Since you have the microphone, thanks. Thank you. I'm wondering if I can call on another couple of friends of mine that are up here in the front row. Someone like Stephen Hope, for example, if you don't mind. Sorry, Steve, to do this, but what is your takeaway? Since you were one of the people that supported this idea of having this meeting.
Well, thanks to all of you. You've given us a lot to think about, and I think very well illustrated the importance of science and research as the basis of this whole debate. But for those of us who are more on the economic or political side of things, the hope is that you here, all of you collectively, but also the Smithsonian as an institution can help form policy for government and policy leaders. Because they need to hear these kinds of talks and really translate that into enlightened leadership at a global level, as many people have mentioned, to change behavior, to change some of the economics of the true cost of the equation of the resources that you're talking about, to make the interested parties really change their approach and behavior with regard to the environment. So I think that's one of my real takeaways and my hopes that this will lead to that kind of discussion at the global and policy level.
Thank you, Stephen. And if you wouldn't mind passing that mic right on to Peggy Burnett, might as well, since you're there. Sorry,
you.
Peggy.
It's on.
It's on. Just.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you for taking the afternoon and being with us and moderating and being so prepared for this event, and to thank you all for coming from the distances you did to be a part of this, to be a part of it for 3 days in August, to put together what is happening, the papers that will come from this, the research that is going to be coming for this. We are very, very grateful. And I would like to say thank you. I'm so pleased the Smithsonian is webcasting this. And so if you would like at any point in time, you can go back and re-listen to this in about a month's time. It will be edited and shortened, and there will be a curriculum added for schools. So I think that the benefits for all of us have been tremendous. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy. I want to come to our panelists and ask them to very briefly just comment on what are your takeaway messages. Is there an oh wow moment or anything? What do you take away from this afternoon? Nigel.
Until 2 years ago, I was running a research organization, and that was my primary job. I had been a research scientist 12, 13 years before. Coming back into the field again, what struck me so phenomenally is how complex it is, how difficult it is for research scientists to actually do the work. I'll give you an idea. Just to set up a single project is amazing, complex, difficult thing. To actually then to read the publications that come out from other people's work, to understand them, synthesize them, try and introduce that into your own work. And I guess I'm a great admirer of the Smithsonian's Tropical Research Institute because it gives some of the top scientists the ability to do that. It gives them resources, and I think this kind of debate is a result of that. And also, I'm particularly impressed here in the US how a number of people are given funding by the National Science Foundation to do what I think are really major out there projects which are really tackling the big issues. There are a few other countries that do that, but not many others.
All right, Tom, what's your takeaway?
Yeah, well, I guess my learning moments probably were greatest when I was listening to Robin talk about secondary forests and the amount of biodiversity in them. And then when I was listening to Claudio talk about his successful experiment at actually inducing some selective regrowth in particular sorts of places. So it left me, those kind of learning moments certainly underscored for me the importance of trying to promote the growth of secondary forests in various forms throughout the tropical world. And I guess the last point there is that the conservation movement has a very important role to play in that process. And I'm somewhat at a loss as to actually what that role should be, but I think it's a very important question that we should be trying to address.
As I said before, just wait till you go out in a secondary forest with Robin. You won't look at it quite the same way, I promise. Elizabeth, what was your learning moment and your takeaway?
Well, apart from learning that in Australia it takes 7 years for cowpats to break down, the two core things that have really struck me through this debate is that in terms of the proximal threats actually at the sites of tropical forests, it's complex, but we've got some good science behind it. We've got some good management lessons and learning behind it in terms of how we deal with some of this destruction and overexploitation at sites. But what's clearly coming through increasingly, and it came through very strongly in both Bill and Joe's talks this afternoon, is that increasingly those threats are not at the sites. They're being driven by things way beyond the sites. They're being driven by expansion of industrial agriculture, which is often being driven by other countries, let alone within there, by urban consumption, again often from other countries, and by global warming, of course. And those are much less tangible, and they're much more difficult to deal with. We've got much less experience in dealing with it, and that's going to be our real big challenge for the next phase of tropical forest. And the final thing that I've learned that I've been so impressed with is how the Smithsonian folks, and particularly Bill and Joe, have taken what could have been a point of real contention and turned it into a very productive debate. And that's all hats off to both of them for that. Thank you.
Good. You want to go at the end or down? Great. I'll come back to you two guys at the end, since you were instigators of this.
I'm leaving here with a feeling of hope that I didn't have when I got here, I have to say. And the hope that I get comes from pieces and parts from what I've heard. Well, the secondary forest discussion that Robin brought on was a lot of new information for me. I see that as hopeful. And Claudio's kind of grassroots level, that kind of work, you haven't seen it in such strong form as you've seen it today. I haven't, working in Brazil myself for a long time. And then from some of the other work and my own work, we're seeing this capacity to come from the international level down as well. That's bottom up, top down with REDD and carbon crediting as a serious and now possible way of bringing ultimately some sort of buffering to this extinction process in terms of forest area. And the technology is there to support it now. I think I showed that. Without a doubt, the community is ready. And then some of the successes, you said there were areas where wildlife is flourishing based on the kinds of interventions that you're able to put down. Those are all pieces and parts of kind of a larger fabric of hope that I have leaving today. Thanks.
Thank you. Robin.
I think what most impressed me was Claudio's example of what initially was a threat, was viewed as a threat to his project, became a blessing and became a route to achieving their goals. And I think that can also be the case for the hunting situation. A lot of the same people that are doing the hunting can be trained to do patrolling. They know what to look for. And I've seen this in other examples too, where some of the most important conservation people on the ground are the farmers themselves who cleared the forest initially. So I think that that's a real take-home message for me, that we need to really think of how we can take the threats that we perceive now and transform them into positive change.
Claudio.
My take-home exam is that more and more I think that we should do tremendous effort to leave the field, to leave our lab, and come to situations like we are having here today, and to discuss the issues as much as we can. Not only with this distinct public that is here, but we have to make an effort to go to decision makers, to policy makers, to presidents of the nations, and to do that, we need to translate what we are doing into, or the results we have, or the solutions, or the suggestions, into a more appealing thing. I mean, more erotized. Let's turn it into very appealing so we can discuss. We have to change policies. We have to make an effort to get to decision makers and to change behavior. And it's not, and turn the crisis into a way to get there. And that's my view. I mean, and there is enough research and results and people and researchers working in the field and all this. It's a matter of translating what we are doing into a way that people can understand and make a tremendous effort to turn this into a tool to change behavior and to change economy and to change policies.
All right, thank you. Bill?
Okay, I guess I've been struck by the fact that there's a surprising amount of agreement about the notion that it's not just, I mean, there's a combination of very large-scale habitat destruction and disruption and climate change that are probably going to pose very serious threats to tropical biodiversity, and the synergism, the interactions between those two things. I think, though, it raises a really important question, is that if we have to worry about climate change and habitat destruction, which one should we be focusing on? Which one should we try to attack? And I would argue that it's habitat destruction is the issue we should actually be focusing on, and for a couple of reasons. One is that by focusing on conserving tropical forests and habitats, that's the cause of 20% of the greenhouse gas emissions. It's a massive cause of emissions. And so by conserving forests, we're going to help to slow down emissions. Secondly, we know that climates are going to change. Temperature is going to change. Rainfall regimes very well may change. And we're going to need big reserves in the tropics, large nature preserves, and areas that, as Joe mentioned, span elevational gradients and climatic gradients. This is what we're going to need to buffer change against the future. And so I think that yes, we have these two very serious threats and other threats, but these two really huge ones, we still have to keep our eye on habitat conservation. And I guess I would just say that I think the carbon trading issue is absolutely essential. It's the best means that we have now for affecting more large-scale forest conservation. And the United States is the only significant country in the world and virtually the largest carbon polluter. And we have not been a part of Kyoto. We have not been a part of any United Nations Framework Convention. And it is time that we join this. And because this is going to dramatically change the carbon markets, it's going to increase demand for carbon credits. And this will have a potentially huge impact on forest conservation. I'm very happy to have this symposium right before the inauguration of the new administration. And I hope that they hear this message loud and clear. Thanks.
Joe?
I guess that many people in our audience might not have been to the tropics and might not understand what we're losing. Imagine you could be here in Maryland or Virginia, wherever it is we are, in 1600, and there were still wood buffalo and cougar and passenger pigeons and chestnut trees and elm trees. Imagine you could be on the Great Plains and still see the great buffalo herds. Well, today, it's still possible in the tropics. There are actually millions of square kilometers of forest where you can still see harpy eagles and jaguars and tigers and elephants and okapis and buffaloes in the forest. The forests are intact. And what our species has set in place is change. The change is now inevitable. The global climate warming, we're committed to it. It's all going to be very different. These countries are going to continue to build access into their forests. You know, we're asking them to, how much forest do we think Brazil should preserve? Should it preserve 50% of its national territory in forest? which is what the case is today? Should it preserve 25% of its national territory in forest? You know, we're asking things that are unrealistic. These countries are going to develop their economies are going to grow. And we're going to lose something. We're going to lose the ability to see the equivalent of the buffalo on the Great Plains. It's, I'm afraid it's inevitable. It's going to happen. Ecotourism is a way that you could help support it. Go and see it while it's still there. But we made our species has made the commitment. It's going to happen. It's going to change. I think we have to stop viewing a lot of what we view as threats, and we have to look at some of these inevitable changes as being positive. We have to start looking at how we can manipulate the changes. There's a wonderful win-win situation that was brought up by Tom Lovejoy that should have come through in my talk between reforestation, secondary forest, and taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. We saw both the habitat loss problems and the global greenhouse gas problems. So we're going to reach a crisis point with climate change, a global crisis point, and I think the solution is going to be in the tropics. It's going to be regrowth of tropical forests. The secondary succession is incredibly rapid. After 20 years, you have 100 metric tons per hectare in above ground biomass alone. It's nothing like an old field that you're used to, which after 20 years is in scrub that's only a few meters tall. These forests are 20 meters tall after just 20 years. The trees can be this big around after just 20 years. So the solution is going to be in the tropics, and it's going to be in reforestation and biology. So I think we're going to go through a bottleneck, and if we're going to emerge from it, it's going to be through this regrowth of tropical forests, absorbing the CO2.
Thank you, Joe. Let me tell you my learning moment and sort of my takeaways from this. I think there were a lot of interesting cases, but probably one of the more striking ones for me was some of the data you showed on the climate change, some of the potential impact on the tropics. And I certainly want to take a look at a few of those slides and look at them more, but I think it really emphasizes the potential impacts of climate change in the tropics beyond some of the ways that probably are out there being looked at. And I think that's an extremely important point that needs to be made, that we can look at that. I sort of, out of this whole afternoon, I sort of heard I've got 5 takeaways, if you wish, big conclusions. One is clearly, I think we all agree that tropical forests are changing very rapidly. How rapidly exactly, there's some issues, some debate, it changes which part of the world, but it's not only the forest, it's what's happening in the forest. I think we heard examples about the impacts of selective forest that you mentioned, or the impacts of wildlife trade, or some of these other areas which probably have been underestimated before, the impacts, and that's certainly one takeaway. The second is, I think everyone agrees that these changes, this loss of forest is having very large impacts on biological diversity. Now, how big or how small, again, is a matter of debate, but in some ways, what some of the data is there probably does suggest that the changes and the losses of biodiversity are less than we might have predicted and expected. Although, as we point out, a lot of the data is missing. So it's probably a lot that we're losing that we don't fully understand. They're clearly important losses, but maybe certainly none of those early predictions seem to be holding. That's kind of interesting. A third one is, as we look into the future, there's no doubt that a number of the big drivers of change are accelerating. And it's important not only the population and some of the more obvious ones, but clearly climate change, which we discussed a lot, but also issues like invasive species. And what's happening in the forest. And the frogs came up repeatedly, but I think there are a number of cases there. I think we really need to look at these changes and how they're going to impact. The fourth takeaway for me is the importance of research and understanding. Because I think a lot of what we saw today is looking at the foundations of having some real data, whether it's biological or socioeconomic data, and especially the importance of trying to understand the complexity of these systems and how they respond to change, and how they're resilient to change. And to be candid, we still don't understand it. I think Joe mentioned at one point, I personally have no doubt that we will have some of these forests, but they're going to be very different. What's going to be the makeup and what's going to be the species and the interactions, I don't think we understand. I think we've gone a long ways to really understand that. And then the other thing in the research is the importance of long-term data and the monitoring, which I think is something key and that I saw repeatedly. But the last takeaway for me is that the good news is there are a number of things we can do. The response options right now, I think we explored a few of them today. We spent quite a bit of time with the protected areas and reserves of one kind or another. I think we saw some data that suggests they are having an impact in some areas. But having said that, the whole concept and approach of these protected areas looking forward in terms of drivers like climate change needs to be looked at very carefully. I think we saw response options relating to consumption, whether it's timber or trade or ornamentals or others, and the importance of education in a lot of these. I think we saw the importance of how, by bringing different stakeholders together, you can really, and empowering them to make some of these decisions, you can turn it around and turn some of these challenges into real opportunities. And I think, just to end, I think that the point about looking at the tropical rainforest in a much broader landscape management context, including these gradients, the secondary forest and the graded forest, and really looking at the potential, the full potential of conservation and management across the landscape is something that is really important. I think we saw some examples. So I think there's we covered a lot of key issues. But let me just finish by saying that I do sense, I'm always an optimist, but I'm especially optimistic at this point in history, because I do think we are close to a tipping point. A tipping point as society, as I mentioned before. I think sometimes it's needed. And I think I'm sensing that. I think the awareness about some of these issues, the consequences, the horror stories of what's happening in some area, but we're getting to a point where I think there is about to be a change. I think clearly all the signals we're getting is there are going to be some changes starting here in the US in terms of climate change and some of these other areas, but I think this is about to spread more broadly. And I'm hopeful that we can all contribute to that. All of us here, whether it's through our research, through our business, through our outreach efforts, or anything else. And let me just close by saying that I'm very pleased to see that we have had this event here at the Smithsonian Institution. Because as you know, the mission of the Smithsonian is about the increase in diffusion of knowledge. And it is about helping us understand the world that we live in. It is about helping us, all of our visitors and all the people we interact with, whether it's people that come here or taking our content out there and through our partners, helping them understand some of these issues and giving them choices and giving them options so they can make better choices as citizens in our society. So I think this is exactly the kind of debate that we wanted to have today. I want to thank all of the panelists, and I'll ask you in just a moment to do that. But before I close, just a couple very quick announcements. One is, a couple of you asked about the presentations that you heard today, and we are going to upload the PowerPoint presentations you saw on the website. So if you want to look at them, you'll have more time to look at them. Just go to the main Smithsonian page. There's a banner right now, but it's at si.edu/TEC. And those will be updated. And as we mentioned, we will be putting the webcast as well available, because fortunately 400 of us came together here today, and it's a great opportunity. But I think part of the challenge is taking this more broadly, sharing it with people that didn't have an opportunity to come to the symposium. And certainly I will be trying to do my job as director of this museum to convey this message and some of the things we've heard to our broader audiences and to decision makers, as I'm sure Charles and other people will in this process. So we will have a reception starting in just a few minutes, so we can continue this informal discussion over a glass of wine, which is always a good setting. But I want to finish by just thanking all of our organizers and all of our panelists for what they've done and for giving us a very stimulating afternoon. Thank you all very much. Thank you all. We'll see you upstairs.
All right.
Look for the elephant.